Chapter 450. Please remember the domain name of this site, or search on Baidu Sanlian Literature website. The two women standing in front of Li Yundong were none other than the tour guide Wuxia and her friend Lan Lan, who had harassed Li Yundong before. When Wuxia suddenly saw Li Yundong appear behind her, she was also shocked. She involuntarily took a step back and stammered, Are you a ghost? You don't make a sound when you walk?" Lan Lan also pulled her arm and whispered nervously, "Xia, is this guy here to settle the score with us?" Although her voice was low, it couldn't escape Li Yundong's ears. Li Yundong frowned and asked, "What score?" "What score?" Ever since Lan Lan had seen Li Yundong's inhuman skills and performance last time, she had been afraid of this mysterious boy. In addition, she had urged Wuxia to post the video on the internet. Originally, she wanted to expose Li Yundong, but she didn't expect that their video would be automatically deleted a few days after it was exposed. For this matter, Lan Lan even went to the customer service of the video network, but her complaints and information were like stones sinking into the sea, and there was no reply. After a while, Lan Lan and Wuxia finally confirmed one thing. Li Yundong was very likely to have a very powerful background, so the video that exposed him was quickly deleted. Originally, Lan Lan, who had thought that she had provoked a powerful person, lived in fear all day long. She was afraid that the other party would come to her door and take her to another province. But after a while, Lan Lan found that her life was still calm and peaceful, and she slowly forgot about this matter. But suddenly, Lan Lan found that this boy had appeared in front of her again. How could she not be frightened? Lan Lan grabbed Wuxia's arm and shouted at Li Yundong, "I posted the video. I will take responsibility for what I did. It has nothing to do with Xia." Li Yundong asked curiously, "Video? What video?" When Lan Lan and Wuxia heard this, they immediately complained to themselves, "Oh no, he confessed without being beaten. It turns out that this guy doesn't know about the video." Li Yundong also quickly remembered. It turned out that the last time someone had posted the video of him fighting with Master Feikong on the internet, it was these two women who had done it. Li Yundong couldn't help laughing. He hadn't expected that his casual question would make the other party feel guilty and confess without being pressed. It could be considered as solving one of his doubts. He deliberately asked with a straight face, "Don't you know that your behavior is an invasion of others' privacy?" Wuxia's eyes were timid, but she deliberately put on a fierce look and said, "Wasn't the video deleted later?" Li Yundong glared at her. "Do you know what kind of trouble this video will bring me?" Although Lan Lan was not tall, she was quite shrewd and righteous. She put her hands on her hips and stood in front of Wuxia, shouting, "What are you doing? So what if you have power and influence? If you come any closer, I'm going to scream." Li Yundong looked at her and saw that although this female tour guide was good-looking, she was far inferior to any of the women around him. He was usually surrounded by beautiful women, but he was still clean. Could it be that in this Buddhist temple he had to do something to her? Wouldn't that be ridiculous? Li Yundong couldn't help laughing out loud. He was not in the mood to argue with the two tour guides. After laughing for a while, he asked, "I won't pursue this matter, but you have to tell me what you said just now. Just now, you said that a few Japanese people were talking in private, right?" Wuxia and Lan Lan looked at each other. Seeing that Li Yundong did not pursue this matter, they became weaker. Wuxia nodded and said, "Yes, did you eavesdrop on our conversation just now?" Li Yundong laughed and said, "You two were talking so loudly. It's impossible for me not to hear it." Wuxia pushed Lan Lan angrily and whispered, "It's all your fault. You have such a loud voice. This is great. You've attracted this guy." Lan Lan also said angrily, "Was my voice that loud? You've always been the one who talked the most, okay?" Wuxia said angrily, "You were the one who started it." Seeing that the two women were complaining to each other, Li Yundong hurriedly asked, "Don't be in a hurry to complain. Tell me where those Japanese people are first, or you can take me to have a look." Wuxia looked at Li Yundong warily. "What do you want to do? As tour guides, we have the obligation to protect the privacy of tourists." Li Yundong glanced at Wuxia. He had always had a bad impression of this female tour guide who worshipped foreign things, but at this time he still said patiently, "The Taoist Assembly is a grand event held once every 4 years by China's Taoism. The Laba Festival will be held next month. These Japanese tourists said that they were going to the Taoist Assembly. I don't think they have any good intentions. After all, you are also descendants of Wuxia. You can't help the Japanese, right?" Wuxia thought about the behavior of these Japanese people before and believed what Li Yundong had said. She raised her eyebrows and asked, "What do you want to do with them?" Li Yundong smiled slightly and said, "Nothing. I just want to take a look. Wuxia and Lan Lan looked at each other and nodded slightly. Lan Lan glanced at Li Yunyang and said worriedly, "You're not a nationalistic youth, are you? Don't hit people. You can beat people to your heart's content, but I'm unlucky." Li Yundong chuckled and said, "As long as they don't cause trouble, why would I go looking for trouble?" Lan Lan muttered in a low voice, then turned around and led the way. Wuxia also nodded to Li Yundong and said, "Come with me. Don't talk later. If you want to know anything, tell me in a low voice and I'll ask around for you." Li Yundong smiled and said, "Don't worry, I won't cause you any trouble." Only then did Wuxia feel relieved. She quickly caught up with Lan Lan and walked side by side with her. The two female tour guides were talking in a low voice. From time to time they would look back at Li Yundong, but when Li Yundong looked at them they quickly dodged his gaze. Li Yundong walked through the corridor with white walls and black tiles and arrived in front of the Arhat Hall. Sure enough, he saw 4 people pointing at the Arhat Hall. There were 3 men and a girl among them. Li Yundong looked over and saw that among the 3 men, an old man was wearing a gray suit with an ochre tie on his chest. There was a golden cherry blossom on his chest. His hair was gray at the temples and the wrinkles on his face were extremely deep. His eyebrows were extremely dignified. It was obvious that he had been in a high position for a long time. There were 2 young men next to him. One of them was a little short. Although he was wearing a mixed suit, his clothes were luxurious and he had an extraordinary temperament. He was holding a handheld camera in his hand. He turned a deaf ear to the sign prohibiting filming in the temple and kept shooting around. Next to this man stood a tall and burly man. This man had his back to Li Yundong and was talking to the little girl, so Li Yundong could not see his appearance clearly. But when Li Yundong looked at this man's back, he felt that this man stood there like a towering mountain, exuding an awe-inspiring aura. As soon as Li Yundong's gaze fell on the back of this tall man, the man's back straightened. He immediately turned around and stared at Li Yundong. This stare was amazing. Li Yundong suddenly had an illusion. It was as if he had encountered a ferocious and terrifying beast in the jungle. All the hair on his body stood on end. At this time, Li Yundong's cultivation had already reached the highest realm of the Yang spirit. It could be said that he was proficient in the aura all over his body. He could hide it in the internal aperture in an instant or burst it out in front of him in an instant. He was like a divine dragon, sometimes hiding under the earth and sometimes soaring above the sky. In the past, Li Yundong didn't know how to restrain his aura, so wherever he went his huge aura would attract people's attention. In addition, his aura was extremely masculine. When women approached him, they would unconsciously attract each other and have a strong affection for him. When men saw him, they would subconsciously repel him and have a strong resistance to him. This situation had also caused Li Yundong a lot of trouble. As Li Yundong's cultivation improved, the aura he restrained had become less and less. Except for his heroic spirit, his appearance was no different from that of an ordinary person. But at this time, when the Japanese suddenly looked at him, Li Yundong felt an extremely terrifying and dangerous aura coming at him. This sense of threat was even stronger than that of Yu Sheng of the Chuanzhen Dragon sect. The aura hidden deep in Li Yundong's body was suddenly aroused by the other party. The aura all over his body was majestic. Wuxia and Lan Lan, who were standing beside Li Yundong, suddenly felt as if there was a pair of invisible hands pushing them away, almost causing them to stagger. Wuxia and Lan Lan looked at Li Yundong in surprise, only to see that the corners of Li Yundong's clothes were fluttering without any wind, and his black hair was standing on end. He was like a fierce tiger in the jungle, and his mane was standing on end. As soon as the aura in Li Yundong's body burst out, the Japanese man's eyes also burst out. Countless black patterns quickly spread out from his neck and quickly climbed to his face. Black aura kept gushing out from his palms. This aura lingered in his palms and did not dissipate, like thick ink condensed by countless ghosts. Li Yundong could even see the ferocious face revealed in the thick ink. As soon as the 2 men looked at each other, their auras became a little uncontrollable, especially the tall Japanese man. He straightened his back and slightly bent his body like a cheetah. He stared at Li Yundong like a falcon, his eyes covetous and his whole body was eager to fight. Li Yundong saw that the other party's aura was cold and powerful, and his eyes were full of hostility, as if he was ready to attack at any time. His eyes narrowed slightly, and his expression did not change. The aura surging all over his body was much more violent and vigorous than before. He stood still and looked at the other party calmly. There was thunder in his heart, but his face was as calm as a lake. Seeing that the 2 were about to fight, the old Japanese man next to him suddenly scolded and said something quickly in Japanese. Then the tall Japanese man narrowed his eyes and looked at Li Yundong for a while. He reluctantly withdrew his aura, then turned around and stood respectfully behind the old man. He lowered his eyebrows and looked humble. It was impossible to tell that this man had been able to release such a cold and domineering aura of Jinshi just now. As soon as he turned around, the little girl behind him was revealed. She was about 13 or 14 years old. Although she looked young, she was quite tall and was already about 1.65 meters tall. She was wearing a lavender kimono with 100 flowers on it and white socks on her feet. Her face was delicate and pretty. She looked at Li Yundong curiously, then gently pulled the sleeve of the tall Japanese man beside her and asked in a low voice, "Shinshu, who is this person?" Shinshu stared at Li Yundong closely. He bowed slightly and said in a deep voice, "Miss Tachibana Wakako, I don't know who this person is, but he is a master." Tachibana Wakako raised her head and giggled at the old man beside her. "Master Xinyan, are there also masters in mainland China? To quickly find this site, please search on Baidu Sanlian Literature website." Chapter 451. Please remember the domain name of this site? Or search on Baidu Sanlian Literature website. Li Yundong saw that the little girl was smiling innocently, but he didn't understand Japanese, so he didn't know that the little girl had said something extremely insulting. But what he didn't know was that the dignified Master Xinyan then said something even more insulting. Master Xinyan smiled at Tachibana Wakako and said in Japanese with a Kyoto accent, "Tachibana Wakako, as early as 300 or 400 years ago, there were masters on this continent. At that time, whether it was Buddhism or Taoism, there were endless heroes in China, far from what we can compare with. But since the Qing dynasty, the Han people on this continent have been ridden by the minority Manchu people. Since then, their cultivation world has been going downhill. Until modern times, the Chinese cultivation world has completely fallen to the bottom, and its power is far inferior to ours. Even the entire Chinese cultivation world can't compare to the power of our Rigoino Tantric sect. Moreover, think about it, how powerful can a sect that can't even protect its own ancestral court and Tibetan sutra be? How powerful can a sect that can't get the support of the state and even the common people don't want to believe in and support it be? How powerful could the disciples taught by such a sect be? In the 7th year of Hirohito, our Mount Koya was appointed by the Mikado to be conferred the title of Master Konghai. Since then, Master Konghai has founded the Shingen sect. From 816 AD to the present, it has not changed. Moreover, no matter what kind of war we suffer, no matter how the dynasty changes, our Mount Koya remains unmoved. Only a sect like ours can produce real masters. These Chinese sects that have suffered for 200 years. If you want to say that there are masters in Shiyuan Temple, I'm willing to believe it. As for other sects, even if they can produce masters, they are fake masters. In front of our masters, they can't withstand a single blow. Tachibana Wakako nodded as if she understood, but then she quickly glanced at Li Yundong and said, "What if Shinshu said this person is a master?" Great Master Xinyan also glanced at Li Yundong. He nodded slightly and said, "Well, this person's eyesight is extremely strong and he is full of energy. He can restrain his aura, but his explosive power is extremely strong. What's even rarer is that he is very young, the age where heroes come from. However, I think the aura in his body is very strange. It's not like the cultivation aura of the various Chinese sects that I'm familiar with. Therefore, I don't think he's a cultivator from any of the major cultivation sects in China. The Chinese cultivation continent can't produce such an expert." Tachibana Wakako couldn't help but look at him curiously again. She asked, "Which sect does this person belong to? Is he from China?" As she said this, she whispered to Shinshu, "Shinshu, can you find out his background?" Hearing her words, Shinsu's expression changed. She raised her drooping eyelids, and an aggressive light immediately shot out of her eyes toward Li Yunyang. His figure also changed from a submissive servant to a great expert with an extraordinary aura in the blink of an eye. Shinshu looked at Li Yundong. Li Yundong seemed to have sensed it and also looked at him. When their eyes met in the air, it was as if Mars had hit the earth, and it seemed that countless blazing sparks could be stirred up in the air. "Shinshu!" Xinyan shouted in a dignified voice, "Step back." Shinshu immediately lowered his head and bowed respectfully. "I'm sorry, Great Master Xinyan. I was impulsive." Xinyan patted Tachibana Wakako's head kindly and said softly, "Tachibana Wakako, have you forgotten our agreement? This time, we are here to collect some information about the Chinese cultivation world, not to make trouble. This person's cultivation seems to be from the Chinese Taoist school. If that's the case, he should go to the Chinese Taoist assembly next month. If he goes, you'll know his background by then. Tachibana Wakako smiled childishly and said with a smile, "Okay then." As she spoke, she said to Li Yundong in Japanese, "Hey, you have to go to the Taoist assembly?" Li Yundong, who had been standing to one side, was confused. He saw them talking quickly in Japanese. Finally, the little girl said something to him with a smile, but he had no idea what she was talking about. Just as he was about to turn his head to ask Wuxia, he saw the old Japanese man in the lead shout something to the Japanese man who was constantly taking pictures. Then the Japanese man respectfully put away the camera, and they turned around and left slowly. Before leaving, Tachibana Wakako looked back at Li Yundong and shouted, "You have to go." Shinshu glanced at Li Yundong and then said to Tachibana Wakako, "Miss Tachibana Wakako, you can actually not pay attention to this person." Tachibana Wakako looked at Shinshu in confusion and asked, "Why?" Shinshu smiled slightly and said, "Although this person's cultivation is strong, there is still a certain gap between him and me. He is even worse than you." Tachibana Wakako said, "Ah? Not as good as you? If you fight with him, what are your chances of winning?" Shinshu thought for a moment and said proudly, 70%. Tachibana Wakako said with a face full of disappointment, "Well, that's too boring. This is the first master I've seen in mainland China." Shinshu laughed and said, "Miss Tachibana Wakako, just now Master Tsinyan said that there are no masters in mainland China." Tachibana Wakako nodded and said, "I see." After that, she turned her head and shouted at Li Yundong, "Hey, if you can't beat Shinshu, you don't have to go to the Taoist assembly. I don't want to see you." After shouting, Tachibana Wakako followed Tsinyan, Shinshu and the others all the way. Li Yundong watched them leave in confusion. He turned his head and asked Wuxia with a confused face, "What did they say? Didn't you say that you would help me translate? Why didn't I see you translate?" At this time Wuxia was already dumbfounded. From what she had heard just now, what these Japanese people had said was like a fairy tale. What Regoino, what cultivation sects, what masters and fake masters. What the hell was all this nonsense? Was it a Shinsha TV series? Wuxia was in a daze. It was not until Li Yundong pushed her that she came to her senses. She stared at Li Yundong with her big black eyes as if she was looking at a visitor from outer space. She thought to herself, could it be that this boy is the legendary strange man with special gifts? As soon as this thought came to her mind, she remembered all kinds of strange things she had seen on this boy before. She couldn't help but believe it, and her heart became more and more shocked. Li Yundong saw that the woman was staring at him blankly, as if she had seen a ghost. He couldn't help frowning and saying, "Hey, I'm talking to you. What were those Japanese talking about just now?" Wuxia calmed down. She recalled what the Japanese had said before and translated it to Li Yundong sentence by sentence. Li Yundong listened carefully. At first, he nodded repeatedly, but when he heard Wuxia translate Tachibana Wakako's words, "Are there masters in mainland China?" Li Yundong suddenly flew into a rage. Li Yundong said angrily, "How dare a little girl speak so arrogantly? Do you really think that there are no masters in Wuxia?" But when Wuxia finished translating Master Tsinyan's words, although Li Yundong was even angrier, he calmed down. The young cultivator pursed his lips tightly, and his masculine and handsome face was full of contemplation. His eyebrows were tightly furrowed, and there was a deep and oppressive aura between his eyebrows. The air around him seemed to freeze. Wuxia, who was beside him, felt as if there was a big stone pressing down on her chest and she could not breathe. After a while, Li Yundong turned to look at Wuxia and asked coldly, "That's all? They didn't say anything else?" When Wuxia saw him speak, the surrounding air seemed to begin to flow, and the big stone on her chest was lifted. Wuxia took a deep breath and said, "It's not over yet. Just now this little girl said something to you." Li Yundong asked with a sullen face, "What did she say?" Wuxia looked at Li Yundong timidly and carefully translated the conversation between Tachibana Wakako and Shinshu before she left to Li Yundong. Before she could finish speaking, before Li Yundong could get angry, Lanlan, who was next to him, also got angry. She said angrily, "The Japanese really don't know the immensity of heaven and earth." After Li Yundong heard this, unexpectedly, he did not fly into a rage as Wuxia had imagined. Instead, he raised his head and laughed angrily. As he laughed, the aura all over his body surged like a tide, like stormy waves, like a surging river. As soon as Li Yundong laughed, all the bronze bells in the entire Shiyuan temple rang in unison, making a buzzing sound. This sound was mixed with Li Yundong's loud and amazing laughter and went straight to the sky. Wuxia, Lanlan, and the other tourists covered their ears in pain. Some of the weaker ones even squatted on the ground. Their facial features were twisted into a ball. At this time, Xinyan, Shinsu, Tachibana Wakako, and the others who had already walked out of the Shiyuan temple heard the voice. They suddenly stopped and turned their heads to look back at the same time. They saw a straight and undispersed aura rushing into the sky from the Shiyuan temple. This aura, accompanied by a burst of laughter, went straight to the 9th layer of the sky, stirred up the wind and clouds in the sky, and changed the color of the sky. Tachibana Wakako looked curiously at the rolling clouds in the sky. She gently pulled Shinsu's sleeve and said, "Shinsu, is this person inviting you to fight?" Shinsu's eyes narrowed and his face became strangely serious. Xinyan looked at the changing sky and listened to the proud laughter. At first he didn't think much of it. Young people are young people after all, and they can't keep their cool. But he listened to the laughter for 5 minutes without any sign of stopping. It was like waves, one wave after another, one wave after another, one wave after another, and each wave was stronger than the last. At this time, Xinyan was finally moved. He opened his eyes slightly and was silent for a long time. After about 5 minutes, when the laughter finally stopped, he slowly let out a long breath. Xinyan turned his head and said to Shinsu, "Shinsu, this person is a strong opponent for you." Shinsu didn't refute. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly, revealing a smile. "We won't know until we fight." With an innocent face, Tachibana Wakako clapped her hands happily and said, "Okay, it turns out that I underestimated him. There will be a good show at the Taoist assembly." She giggled and turned to Master Xinyan. "Master Xinyan, I think there are also masters in mainland China." Xinyan didn't even look back. He smiled and said, "Is there? You'll know when the time comes." To quickly find this website, please search on Baidu Sanlian Literature website. Chapter 452. Please remember the domain name of this site? Or search on Baidu Sanlian Literature website. Li Yundong laughed out loud. On the one hand, he was expressing his contempt and disdain for the arrogant words of these Japanese. On the other hand, he was formally inviting them to fight. But after laughing for a while, he waited where he was for a long time. He didn't see these Japanese turn back to fight with him. Li Yundong knew that they must have left. He sneered to himself, turned his head, and apologized to Wuxia and Lanlan, who were in pain. Then he quickly left Shiyuan Temple. After he left, 2 old monks walked out of the backyard of Arhat Hall. They were Exancheng and Purin. The 2 old monks looked at each other and chanted the name of Buddha in unison. Exancheng sighed and said, "Jindan descends to the world, and Wisdom King descends to the world. Thunder retribution descends from the sky, and all the foxes go down the mountain. The temple bells ring together and the demons fight. The black fox reappears and the world is in chaos. Purin, your disciples' words are really accurate." Purin also looked worried. He sighed and said, "Amitba, I hope the cultivation world can get through this tribulation." The 2 old monks sighed in unison, and the deep wrinkles on their faces became more and more crisscrossed. After Li Yundong left Shiyuan Temple, he walked quickly and aimlessly all the way. He thought of what the Japanese had said, and his heart seemed to be blocked by something, which made him feel very uncomfortable. But when Li Yundong thought about it carefully, he had to admit that the old Japanese man's words were indeed very reasonable. How powerful can a sect that can't even protect its own ancestral court and Tibetan sutras be? How powerful can a sect that can't get the support of the state, and even ordinary people don't want to believe in and support it? How powerful can a disciple from such a sect be? These 3 sentences were like daggers that pierced through Li Yundong's chest. They made him angry but also made him feel a trace of sadness and helplessness. No wonder Master Purin asked me about the true meaning of cultivation in such a serious manner. No wonder Ziyuan sighed over and over again about the calamity encountered by the cultivation world. Li Yundong stood on the bustling street, surrounded by pedestrians and heavy traffic. However, he felt that there was a dead silence around him, and there was a lifeless atmosphere everywhere. He even felt that the faces of everyone on the side of the road were gray and lifeless. Li Yundong clenched his fists, and his eyes were full of unwillingness and anger. He thought to himself, "These Japanese look down on our Chinese cultivation world. When the Taoist assembly begins, I'll let them see if there are any masters in our mainland." As soon as he thought of this, he quickly walked to a place where there was no one around. Then he turned into a beam of cyan light and quickly flew toward Tianan City. When Li Yundong returned to his home in Tianan City, it was already evening. After entering the house, Li Yundong saw the little foxes chattering together, happily counting the banknotes, and then dividing the spoils one by one. The little foxes originally wanted to divide the money in private, but when they saw Li Yundong enter the room with a cold face, they suddenly felt like thieves who had been caught red-handed. They all looked at each other guiltily. Ling Yu braced herself to stand up and said with a forced smile, "Leader, you're back? We are counting the money we made today. By the way, leader, do you know how much money we made?" Although Li Yundong was depressed, he returned home and faced the little beauties who were smiling like flowers. No matter how unhappy he was, the anger in his heart dissipated a lot at this time. He suppressed the unhappiness in his heart, smiled faintly and said, "What's the matter? Did you make money today?" When the little foxes saw Li Yundong smiling, they immediately became excited. They rushed to Li Yundong with a smile and said, "Leader, you can't look down on us anymore. We made a lot of money today." Li Yundong chuckled and was about to speak when he suddenly saw Su Chan poking her head out of her room in surprise. "Yundong, you're back?" After that, the little girl ran toward Li Yundong barefoot, like a swallow returning to the woods, and threw herself into his arms. Li Yundong hugged Su Chan tightly. He rubbed the girl's hair with tenderness in his heart and said with a smile, "Did you make any mischief while I was away?" Su Chan rolled her eyes. She thought of the middle-aged man who had thrown down 10,000 yuan and ran out. She felt a little guilty and avoided his gaze. She secretly stuck out her tongue and didn't say anything for a while. Li Yundong was also full of worries, so he didn't notice Su Chan's expression. The little foxes beside him also joined in and said one after another, "Leader, the lady boss took us to make a lot of money today. Look. Immediately, one of the little foxes held the money in front of Li Yundong as if they were offering a treasure. Li Yundong took a rough look and saw that there was probably a few thousand yuan. He said with a smile, "Not bad, you made a few thousand yuan on the first day? That's good, it seems that there are quite a lot of guests." His words made the little foxes secretly stick out their tongues. One of them opened her mouth and said, "Just one." Before she could finish saying the word guests, the other little foxes next to her covered her mouth and dragged her to the back. Li Yundong was stunned for a moment, but he didn't take it seriously. He asked casually, "One what?" Ling Yu rolled her eyes and quickly said to smooth things over, "We can make so much money in just one day. Leader, aren't we amazing?" Li Yundong couldn't help laughing and said, "Do you still want to do business at night? I think you are obsessed with money." After that, he patted the little girl's head and said, "Chaner, you did a good job today. You didn't cause me any trouble. Well, you deserve praise. By the way, I saw you dividing the money just now, didn't I? Well, you can divide the money among yourselves. Just take it as a red envelope from me. Don't hand it in." When the little foxes heard this, they immediately cheered in unison, "Long live the leader! Long live the leader!" Li Yundong chuckled, nodded to Su Chan, and then motioned for her to come to his room. The little girl followed Li Yundong to his room uneasily. After entering the door, she rubbed the corner of her clothes with both hands, wondering whether she should tell Li Yundong what had happened today. The little girl was not a fool. Although she had not reacted to what had happened today at first, after thinking about it for a while, she finally understood and confirmed one thing. She had done something wrong and must have caused trouble again. But she had caused trouble. Should she tell Yundong? If she did, Yundong would blame her for causing trouble again. The praise just now would have been in vain. But if she didn't tell him, she would feel that it was not a good thing. It would make her feel very uneasy to keep something hanging in the air. In the blink of an eye, the little girl's mind was racing, but Li Yundong didn't notice her thoughts. He said softly to Su Chan, "Chaner, I've borrowed the burning thumb pot. Take a look." As he spoke, he took out the burning thumb pot and held it in front of Su Chan. Su Chan's eyes lit up. She saw that the burning thumb pot was dark green. From a distance it looked brilliant and beautiful. At first glance, she could tell that it was not an ordinary object. When she got closer, she saw that the light in the room shone on the burning thumb pot, reflecting colorful light. In each different refraction surface of the glass, Su Chan could see her charming face. It was as if the burning thumb pot was a spirit space, reflecting countless versions of herself. For a moment, Su Chan was a little dazed by the exquisite burning thumb pot. She subconsciously reached out to touch it, but as soon as her fingers touched it, her whole body suddenly shook and she quickly retracted her hand as if she had been electrocuted. Li Yundong smiled and said, "What's wrong? What are you afraid of? If you like it, take it and look at it more." Su Chan shook her head like a rattle drum and looked at the glass bowl with envy and fear in her eyes. She said, "No, this burning thumb pot has a lot of Buddhist magic power. I can't touch it. When I touched it just now, my whole body felt like it had been electrocuted. It was very uncomfortable." Li Yundong played with the burning thumb pot in his hand strangely. Really? Why didn't I feel it? Su Chan looked at Li Yundong enviously and said, Yundong, you are a human so you naturally can't feel it, but I am a fox spirit. This burning thumb pot is a Buddhist magic item. Its Buddhist power is solemn and majestic, and it is specially used to restrain our demon aura. Moreover, colored glass is one of the 7 treasures of Buddhism, and it is also the incarnation of a monk's 1,000-year cultivation. In all the Buddhist scriptures, body and spirit like colored glass is regarded as the highest realm of Buddhist cultivation. The Medicine Master's Colored Glass Buddha's Original Vows Merit Sutra says, when I get Bodhi in my next life, my body will be like colored glass, clear inside and out, pure and clean. From this, it can be seen that colored glass is the purest thing in the world. Muddy demon bodies like us can't touch it. After hearing this, Li Yundong laughed. He hugged the little girl and intimately rubbed the tip of his nose against her forehead. He said with a smile, silly girl, in my opinion, you are the purest and most pure person in the world. As for this, Li Yundong raised the burning thumb pot high with one hand and said with a smile, this is just a magic item. No matter how important a magic item is, how can it be compared with a person? Su Chan felt warm in her heart when she heard this. She thought to herself, Yundong loves me so much, but I can't tell him frankly. Instead, I hide something in my heart. How can I be worthy of Yundong's feelings for me? Thinking of this, the little girl opened her mouth and was about to tell Li Yundong what had happened today, but Li Yundong held her with one hand and looked at the burning thumb pot. He sighed and said, Chaner, I only borrowed the burning thumb pot this time, but I didn't get the Bafang demon subduing formation. I don't know if I can catch Yanfang's yang spirit with this burning thumb pot alone. As he said this, he lowered his head and looked at Su Chan apologetically. He said softly, but don't worry, I will try my best to help you find your master Ao Wushuang. Su Chan's words were stopped by Li Yundong again. She nodded obediently and opened her mouth to speak again, but Li Yundong touched her hair and said, well, I know what you want to say. Don't say thank you or anything. We don't need to say such polite words. You go out first. I'm going to mobilize my Jinchi and take the burning thumb pot for my own use. Su Chan opened her mouth and said, but Yundong, I have something to tell you. Li Yundong asked in confusion, is it very important? Su Chan was stunned for a moment. She lowered her head guiltily and said weakly, it seems, it's not that important. Li Yundong laughed and said, then let's talk about it after I subdue the burning thumb pot. You go out and wait for me. Su Chan looked at Li Yundong hesitantly and finally swallowed the words that were on the tip of her tongue. The little girl thought to herself, I'd better let Yundong subdue the burning thumb pot first. If I tell him about it and he gets angry, what if it affects his subduing of the magical item? Thinking of this, Su Chan looked at Li Yundong timidly and said in a low voice, well, Yundong, I'm going out. Li Yundong nodded to Su Chan with a smile. After she went out, the smile on Li Yundong's face slowly disappeared. He sighed softly and muttered to himself, according to Master Purin and Master Xinqing, it seems that a great calamity is coming in the cultivation world. Moreover, the Japanese have come to join in the fun. I really don't know what the situation will be like. What will happen to me and Chaner? What will happen to the Fox Zen school? Thinking of this, Li Yundong felt that his thoughts were in a mess for a moment. He composed himself and slowly calmed down. He sat down cross-legged, then held the burning thumb pot with both hands and injected his Jinchi into it, preparing to subdue this Buddhist magical item. At first, Li Yundong could feel that there was a powerful force resisting his Jinchi in the burning thumb pot. He knew that this was the power of the burning thumb pot's own magical item. Li Yundong felt that this magical item had developed a strong resistance. He was not surprised but happy because subduing a magical item was like training a horse. The more powerful the magical item was, the stronger its resistance was, and the harder it was to subdue it. Moreover, the methods of taming each magical item were different. Li Yundong cheered up and mobilized all the Jinchi in his body to inject into the burning thumb pot. As he injected more and more Jinchi, the resistance of the burning thumb pot became weaker and weaker. But when this resistance was about to disappear, Li Yundong suddenly felt a huge and unparalleled force pouncing on him. Before Li Yundong could even react, this force was like an overwhelming tsunami, instantly engulfing his entire divine sense and plunging him into the boundless darkness. I just came back from Shanghai. I need to hurry up and finish this chapter. To quickly find this website, please search on Baidu Sanlian Literature website. Chapter 453. Please remember the domain name of this site. or search on Baidu Sanlian Literature website. Cultivation was as difficult as ascending to heaven. Cultivation was like ascending to heaven. It was like stepping on an invisible and rugged road to heaven. The higher one's cultivation, the more miserable it would be when one day he slipped and fell. Therefore, the greater the cultivator, the more careful and cautious he would be when cultivating. He was afraid that if he took a wrong step, he would fall into a bottomless abyss and be doomed eternally. Mortals who had not yet heard the way wanted to cultivate. They had to firm their beliefs, painstakingly pursue the true way between heaven and earth, and painstakingly find a true master who could guide them. As for those rookie cultivators who had heard the way, if they wanted to cultivate further, they had to solve the big problem of wealth. Even if they solved the big problem of wealth, they had to continue to solve the two big problems of partner and mansion. Even if all of the above were solved, they still had to face the many magic items in the world. Each magic item had its own unique attributes and characteristics, and the methods of subduing them were also different. Before, Li Yundong had subdued the Fan of Seven Treasures and the Lioha smoothly. It could be said that he had done it in one go, so he had also relaxed his vigilance about subduing magic items. After all, he had only cultivated for a short time, and when he was subduing magic items, he didn't have Zi Yuan, who had rich cultivation experience, to give him advice. He didn't know what kind of situation he would encounter when subduing a famous Buddhist magic item like the Burning Thumb Pot. The Burning Thumb Pot was the personal magic item of the famous Buddhist monk, Fa Hai. Although Fa Hai had passed away and left this magic item to his descendants, it had not always been in a state of no use. There were countless famous monks who had used the Burning Thumb Pot to subdue demons. Among them, the most famous user was Master Haideng, born in the 28th year of the Guangxu dynasty in the Qing dynasty, whose original name was Fan Wubing. After Master Haideng had passed away in 1989, this Buddhist magic item had wandered into the world and finally fell into the hands of Du Fei of the Chuanjin sect. It had only been more than 20 years since 1989, and the powerful Jinqi in the magic item had not dissipated much. Moreover, there was a big difference between this Burning Thumb Pot and the Fan of Seven Treasures. That was, the psychic Fan of Seven Treasures had never been used since the death of Tang Xianzong. Therefore, the power of this Buddhist magic item had always been in a state of decline. However, the Burning Thumb Pot was different. It had been used by Fa Hai for more than 30 years. Fa Hai's powerful and vigorous Buddhist power alone had protected it for more than 30 years. Coupled with the close protection and use of the famous monks of the past, the Buddhist power of this celestial device had not weakened. Instead, it had become stronger with each generation. Every generation of famous monks had left their mark on the Burning Thumb Pot to test the next user, so as to prevent the Burning Thumb Pot from falling into the hands of evil people. Secondly, the Burning Thumb Pot was made of colored glass, and colored glass was a Buddhist magic item. It was clear inside and outside, pure and flawless. Therefore, in order to subdue such a pure magic item, the cultivator must first beat clear inside and outside, pure and flawless. Otherwise, it would cause the rebound of the Jinqi mark left by the eminent monks of the Burning Thumb Pot, which would launch a fierce counterattack. When Li Yundong had talked with Master Purin and Master Xinqing in Shiyuan Temple, he had already had lingering doubts in his heart. In addition, after coming out, he had encountered the rampant Japanese, which had increased the anger and hostility in Li Yundong's heart. Although Li Yundong had held his breath and calmed his mind before entering meditation, these negative emotions in the depths of his mind had not been driven out. In such a situation, he had subdued the Burning Thumb Pot, and the hostility and anger in his body had been detected by the Burning Thumb Pot. Thus, it had determined that Li Yundong was a hateful and violent villain. The Jinqi mark of the eminent monks of the past had begun to fiercely counterattack, pulling Li Yundong's divine sense into the spirit space of the Burning Thumb Pot. Although Li Yundong was in meditation at this time, his divine sense was extremely clear. He could feel that he was in a boundless dark world. He seemed to be in a vast and boundless illusory world. The whole world did not exist, and even he did not exist. The world was empty, and so was he. His physical body was empty, and so was his Jinqi. It was as if there was only an illusory and empty soul left. However, in this situation where everything was empty, he could still feel the existence of his divine sense. No matter what he did, he could not get rid of this situation. This situation really shocked and frightened Li Yundong. He suddenly remembered what Su Chan had once said: there are three great horrors in cultivation. They are the great horrors between life and death, the great horrors between heaven and earth, and the great horrors between reality and illusion. Li Yundong had more or less experienced these three horrors. He had thought that after he had experienced them, they would no longer appear to bother him. However, he had not expected that these three horrors were the common demons of all cultivators in the world since ancient times. Countless cultivators had fallen under these three horrors. As long as they relaxed a little, these three horrors would take advantage of their weakness and make them fall into chi deviation. These high and mighty cultivators would fall into the mortal world and become trash that was inferior to even ordinary people in the mud. When Li Yundong had first reached the Zhuji phase, he had encountered such a great horrors between reality and illusion. At this time, his divine sense had been dragged into the spirit space of the burning thumb pot. It was as if his divine sense had been imprisoned in another vast universe. Not only could Li Yundong not distinguish between reality and illusion, but he also could not break free from this realm of nothingness. He was like a tiny speck of dust, floating endlessly in this vast and boundless universe. No one knew when he would reach the other side and when he would be able to break free. While Li Yundong was trapped in this empty world, Su Chan returned to her room. The little girl was lying on the bed, tossing and turning. Her extremely beautiful eyes were wide open, and her heart was heavy with worries. The little girl had been thinking about what had happened in the tea house. She repeatedly told herself, "When Yundong subdues the burning thumb pot, I will tell him about it. But what if Yundong gets angry at that time? What if he dislikes me? He gave me the tea house, but I still caused such trouble for him? Can I not tell him? It seems that he didn't come to make trouble for me." The little girl struggled in her heart and tossed and turned in bed all night. It was not until dawn that she fell into a deep sleep. After dawn, the noises of the little foxes rang out in the living room, and the little girl woke up in a daze. After Su Chan got up, she raised her head and yawned. Then, wearing a long pajamas and a pair of slippers, she walked to Li Yundong's room with sleepy eyes. The little girl had been thinking about the problem before she went to bed last night in her dreams. Now she finally couldn't help it. She got up and went to find Li Yundong. As she walked, she muttered, "No, I have to tell Yundong about this as soon as possible, or it will torture me to death." Su Chan walked to the door of Li Yundong's room. She first tilted her head to listen to the situation in the room, but there was no sound, not even the slightest movement. Su Chan was slightly stunned and thought, "Is Yundong sleeping or subduing a powerful magical weapon?" She looked at the sky and thought, "It's already past 8 o'clock in the morning. It can't be that he hasn't finished the whole night, right?" The little girl thought for a moment, then tentatively knocked on the door and called out weakly, "Yundong, are you there?" But her call was like a stone sinking into the sea, and there was no response. Su Chan said in surprise, "No way. If he was sleeping, he should have woken up with this call." The sleep of cultivators was very light, and it was only to meet the need of rest for their body functions. A little shout would wake them up immediately. Su Chan thought for a moment and said, "Could it be that he's really subduing the burning thumb pot? If he's really subduing the burning thumb pot, then I can't disturb Yundong. What if he goes crazy?" With that thought in mind, she quietly left Li Yundong's room and walked into the bathroom with a frown on her face. When she saw herself in the mirror, her hair was a little messy and fluffy. She ran her fingers through her hair anxiously. "Oh my God," she murmured. "I'm so upset." At this time, Li Yundong, who was drifting aimlessly in the world of nothingness, seemed to hear a familiar and soft voice calling his name from the other side of the distant world. Li Yundong's spirit was suddenly lifted. Like a person who had lost his backbone, he suddenly straightened his back and swam in the direction of the sound with all his might. However, in this vast spirit space, no matter how hard Li Yundong swam, he couldn't reach the other side. After an unknown period of time, Li Yundong stopped moving in despair. He looked at the thick and boundless darkness in front of him in horror and thought, "No, I may never be able to swim to the other side like this." But he quickly thought, "But I clearly heard Channer's voice on the other side. She must be there. How can I leave her alone? In this world, no one can stop me from separating from Channer. If Buddha blocks me, I will kill Buddha. If God blocks me, I will kill God. How can this small spirit space stop me?" The obsession in Li Yundong's heart suddenly rose, and all the Jinchi in his body seemed to suddenly appear in his body. He could feel that his illusory body had become tangible again. In an instant, he had transformed into the immovable Wisdom King with 3 heads and 6 arms. When he raised his hand, there was thunder and lightning flashed. At this time, Li Yundong was struggling violently in the spirit space. At first, all the power he had vented was absorbed and swallowed up by the vast dark chaotic world. But as time went on, Li Yundong's anger became stronger and stronger. He seemed to have incarnated into a furious Wisdom King, and heaven and earth were trembling in his anger. Slowly the spirit space began to shake. The originally lifeless dark and chaotic world began to have flowing wind, as if a dark and trapped eggshell had been shattered by Li Yunyang's power. Slowly there was a gap, so the light from the outside world also penetrated in bit by bit. Li Yundong saw that there was more and more light around him, and he also struggled more and more crazily to vent his anger, as if he wanted to completely smash the cage that trapped him. But when he was about to smash the spirit space, Li Yundong suddenly heard a distant and dignified voice slowly coming. This voice sounded like the Buddha of the Western Nirvana realm speaking solemnly. What is cultivation? Li Yundong was stunned when he heard this voice. He stopped destroying the spirit space and looked around with his eyes wide open, as if he was looking for the direction of the voice. He said, "Cultivation is to cultivate the mind." The voice soon came from all directions again. Then what is cultivation? Li Yundong said impatiently, "Cultivation is to cultivate a fundamental heart that is not impatient, not angry, not happy, not greedy, and not angry." The voice said again, "Since you know what cultivation is, you should also know that your heart is full of obsession, and obsession is delusion. I can't let people with delusion go." Li Yundong couldn't help but say angrily, "Bullshit. Why do you people cultivate and pray to Buddha? Isn't it to become a Buddha one day? Isn't this kind of thought an obsession? Is this kind of obsession to become a Buddha also a delusion?" The voice was silent for a while and then said, "Amitabha, you are right but also wrong. But no matter what, you can continue to move forward and see how far you will go if you follow your obsession." After that, the voice didn't sound again. Li Yundong waited for a long time. Finally, he waved his fists and released the thunder and lightning in his hands toward the spirit space. With a loud bang, the dark spirit space was instantly smashed by Li Yundong. His eyes suddenly lit up, as if he had gone from a world of polar night to a world of polar day. Li Yundong narrowed his eyes slightly. After adapting to the dazzling light, he took a closer look. Li Yundong was shocked by what he saw. To quickly find this website, please search on Baidu Sanlian Literature website. Chapter 454. Please remember the domain name of this site? Or search on Baidu Frowny Face Sanlian Literature website. In front of Li Yundong was a huge world. This world was so big that it was even bigger than the chaotic universe he had just been in. In the center of this world there was an incomparably huge mountain. This mountain stood tall and majestic, connecting the heavens and the earth. The mountain stood on a black round wheel. Below the black round wheel was a golden round wheel. Below it was a red round wheel, and below it was a cyan round wheel. Outside this cyan round wheel was a vast void. The top and bottom of the mountain were large, but the center was small. A sun and moon hung on the mountainside at the same time. Beside the sun and moon, there were 4 skies that seemed to have been cut down, occupying the 4 sides of the mountainside. When Li Yundong saw this mountain, he was so shocked that he couldn't control himself. He suddenly thought of the Buddhist scriptures he had seen. He immediately remembered that the scene in front of him was recorded in the Buddhist scriptures. This mountain was Mount Meru, and these 4 skies were the 4 heavenly king heavens. Above the 4 heavenly king heavens were Haoli heavens, Yama heavens, Tusita heavens, Huala heavens, and Free Transformation heavens. Above them were the 18 heavens of the color realm and the 4 heavens of the colorless realm. At the root of Mount Meru, there were 7 layers of golden mountain and 7 layers of perfume sea, surrounding it. Each layer of sea was surrounded by a mountain. Outside the 7th layer of golden mountain was the alkali sea, and outside the alkali sea was the Great Taiwei Mountain. There were 4 major continents around the alkali sea, namely the Dongxing Divine Continent, the Nanzhangbu Continent, the Aparagodania Continent, and the North Continent. They were called the 4 heavens. Beside each continent were 2 central continents, and hundreds of small continents were dependents. Li Yundong looked at the continents one by one and saw that there were 9 mountains and 8 seas in this world, 1 sun and 1 moon for major continents and 6 heavens. Li Yundong knew that this was the 3,000 great worlds mentioned in the Buddhist scriptures. While Li Yunyang was stunned, a dignified and solemn voice suddenly came from the sky of this world. "Since you insist on your obsession, why don't you go to the Trichiliacosm to find your true self and your obsession? As long as you can find your true obsession and your true self, you can get out of this world." After listening to the voice, Li Yundong's mind moved, and his body immediately turned into a long rainbow. In the blink of an eye, he arrived at the mountainside of Mount Meru. He looked up and saw that there were billions of creatures in the Trichiliacosm, and he and Suchan were in every world. Li Yundong was shocked and thought, "There are 3,000 worlds and 10 billion mortal worlds. How can I find them? How can I get out?" When Li Yundong smashed the chaotic world and came to the Trichiliocosm, he had no idea that he had been drawn into the spirit space of the burning thumb pot for a full day and night. In the evening, the little foxes, who had slaughtered a whole day's worth of customers from the tea house, returned home happily. The little foxes were still carelessly counting their gains for the day. They had no idea that their sect leader had been trapped in the spirit space of the magic treasure. It wasn't until the little foxes were hungry that they remembered something. Why hasn't the leader cooked yet? A little fox rubbed her stomach and shouted, "Madam, I'm starving. When will we eat?" At this time, Ling Yu suddenly had an idea and said to Su Chan, "By the way, Suj. Madam, hurry up and ask the leader how to deal with the money. It would be great if it was like yesterday." Su Chan also felt very strange in her heart. She had never seen Li Yundong stay in his room all day without coming out. The little girl answered, stood up and walked upstairs to the door of Li Yundong's room. She gently knocked on the door and asked tentatively, "Yundong, are you in there?" But after knocking for a while there was still no response. Su Chan thought to herself, did he go out? The longer Li Yundong had been the leader of the Fox Zen school, the more dignified he had become. No one dared to open his door without permission. Only Su Chan, who had a special relationship with Li Yundong, dared to open the door and take a look. After Su Chan pushed the door open, she carefully poked her head in through the crack of the door. She glanced around the room and was immediately shocked. She saw Li Yundong sitting cross-legged on the floor of the room, holding the burning thumb pot in his hand. His whole body was soaked and the expression on his face was changing. Sometimes he gritted his teeth and sometimes he looked sad. Su Chan was shocked. She knew that this was a sign of Qigong deviation. She quickly opened the door and rushed toward Li Yundong. But when the little girl was about to touch Li Yundong, she immediately stopped. She knew that Li Yundong was in Qigong deviation at this time. If she rashly touched him, she would definitely harm him. Su Chan was so anxious that she was pacing around in circles at a loss. At this time, Ling Yu, who had been waiting impatiently downstairs, came to the door and took a look inside. When she saw it, she suddenly exclaimed, "Oh no, the leader is in Qigong deviation." The shout was terrible. The little foxes downstairs suddenly panicked and rushed upstairs to see what was going on. Su Chan saw that they were rushing up like a swarm of 1,000 sparrows, chirping non-stop. She was afraid that they would disturb Li Yundong, so she immediately turned around and glared at them, which was rare for her. She said sternly, "Why are you making so much noise? Be quiet." The little foxes were used to playing with Su Chan, so they had never seen her so angry. Especially at this time, when they saw the fierce look in Su Chan's eyes, the little foxes were so scared that they didn't dare to speak again. At this moment, the little foxes clearly noticed one thing. Although Su Chan was usually playful, innocent, and kind, if it was related to Li Yundong, she could also be ruthless. Su Chan's fierceness was only for a moment. After stabilizing the situation, she quickly returned to her usual self. The little girl knew that at this time, Zhou Qin had gone out to build the Zhuji phase, and Ziyuan and Ruan Hongling were accompanying her. As the leader, Li Yundong was in the predicament of Qigong deviation. Except for the two remaining Shirbas, Zhuang Yiting and Lu Yuehong, there was no one in the whole Fox Zen school who could make decisions. Su Chan subconsciously thought of her Shirbua. She drove the little foxes out of the door and carefully closed the door of Li Yundong's room. She asked anxiously, "Where are Shirbua Zhuang Yiting and Shirbua Lu Yuehong? They may be able to help. Go and find them." Some of the little foxes immediately ran to Zhuang Yiting and Lu Yuehong's room. They didn't knock on the door and pushed it open, but as soon as they entered, they came out disappointed. "They're not here." Su Chan's heart skipped a beat. "They're not here?" The little foxes nodded at the same time. "No?" Su Chan couldn't help frowning. "Where are they at this time? Why isn't anyone here?" Ling Yu also stamped her feet and said, "I'm so worried. What's wrong with the leader? What should we do?" At this time, all the people who could make decisions were gone, and the little foxes all looked at Su Chan. When Su Chan saw them looking at her, she suddenly felt the pressure increase, but she knew that in the current situation, she couldn't shirk her responsibility like she had in the tea house. Su Chan took a deep breath, and her charming face showed an unprecedented calmness. She said, "Don't worry everyone. At present, Yundong is very likely to have failed in the process of subduing the magical item, and his divine sense is trapped in it. At this time, none of us can help him. We can only wait quietly for him to break out of the trap. At this time, what we have to do is take good care of ourselves, don't cause trouble for Yundong, and don't disturb him." The little foxes all looked at Su Chan eagerly, as if they felt that this little girl, who was usually carefree, had grown up a lot. She actually had the demeanor of a real boss in her speech and behavior, and she could control the situation. The little foxes all felt that Su Chan's words were reasonable and nodded one after another. Ling Yu frowned and sighed softly. Why is our Fox Zen school so troubled? It's not easy for us to have a good leader, but we've encountered such a dangerous thing. I really hope that the leader can get through this without any danger. If he can really get through this, I will eat vegetarian food and pray to Buddha every day in the future. As soon as she said this, the other little foxes also agreed in unison. Yes, if the leader can get through this, we will also offer incense to Buddha. Su Chan forced a smile and said, "What's the use of thanking Buddha after he's saved? This is worse than making a last-minute effort." As she said this, she knelt down, put her palms together, faced the west, and murmured, "Buddha, Buddha, the grandmaster of our Fox Zen school, Pan Shi, was enlightened by Zen master Baizhang and became an immortal. Our sect has some fate with Buddhism. For the sake of this little bit of fate, please save Yundong. From now on, I, Su Chan, will continue to worship Buddha." After that, the little girl's pretty face was full of sincerity and solemnity. She put her palms together and recited the Great Compassion Mantra. Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva said, "World-honored one, if all living beings recite the Great Compassion Mantra and fall into the three evil paths, I swear that I will not be enlightened and recite the Great Compassion Mantra. If all living beings are not born in the Buddhist kingdom, I swear that I will not be enlightened and recite the Great Compassion Mantra. If all living beings are not born in the Buddhist kingdom, I swear that I will not be enlightened and recite the Great Compassion Mantra. If all living beings are not born in Samadhi, I swear that I will not be enlightened." The little foxes next to her were infected by Su Chan's piety. They all knelt down beside her, put their palms together, and chanted the Great Compassion Mantra in unison. For a moment, the solemn chanting echoed in the luxurious and modern living room. It came from the open balcony window next to the living room and drifted far away, lingering for a long time. The chanting went on for the whole night. It wasn't until dawn the next day that Su Chan slowly opened her eyes and stopped chanting the scriptures. She looked back and saw that the little foxes had fallen asleep in the living room. It was obvious that they were tired after chanting all night and had fallen asleep one after another. Su Chan got up carefully without disturbing them. She carefully went to Li Yundong's room, opened the door and took a look. She saw that Li Yundong's expression was still changing, but he was no longer sweating. It could be seen that the Jinqi in his body had slowly calmed down and was no longer rushing as fiercely as before. Su Chan put her palms together in surprise and sighed silently in her heart, "Thank Buddha for his blessing. Yundong's situation has not worsened. It seems that chanting sutras is still useful. Today I will recite sutras for Yundong all night." Thinking of this, the little girl didn't feel tired. Instead, she felt refreshed and her heart was full of enthusiasm and motivation. In the little girl's opinion, as long as she continued chanting sutras like this, Yundong would break out of seclusion sooner or later. But what Su Chan didn't know was that Li Yundong had been trapped for a full 18 days. To quickly find this website, please search on Baidu Sanlian Literature website. Chapter 455. Please remember the domain name of this site, or search on Baidu Sanlian Literature website. While Li Yundong was trapped in the Trachelia chasm, Zhou Qin, who had been trudging all the way, finally entered Tibet. Although Zhou Qin had followed the route that Li Yundong had taken to the west, by the time she entered Tibet, the route had already deviated. Li Yundong had set out from Tianan City and finally arrived at the Beilonggu area of Baiyu County in western Sichuan. He had entered Tibet from the Kathuo Temple, while Zhou Qin had entered the Zhuji Phase area from the Kashan area of Langkazi County in Shannan, Tibet. Along the way, Zhou Qin's shoes had 2 holes in them. At this time, her walking shoes had 2 holes in the front, and the soles were almost worn flat. At this time, she was wearing a dark gray long-sleeved casual dress with a pair of straight trousers. This young lady was carrying a bag. Although her clothes were a little messy, Zhou Qin was still very clean. Especially at this time, her qi and blood were incredibly strong. At this time, the Qinghai Tibet Plateau was already covered in silver, but she was wearing a thin shirt and trousers. Her pretty face looked white and rosy, and her skin was so delicate that it could be broken by the wind. Even though she was covered in dust, it still could not hide her beauty. In the cold winter of Tibet, Zhou Qin rarely saw pedestrians along the way. Occasionally she would see Tibetans slowly coming all the way in yak carts. They were all wearing cotton-padded jackets and trousers, wrapped tightly to resist the cold and harsh winter. These Tibetans saw that Zhou Qin was wearing a thin shirt and trousers. Her slim figure was as weak as a winter sweet in the cold wind, as if she would freeze in the next second. They all looked at Zhou Qin in surprise. Some Tibetans kindly took out warm cotton-padded clothes from their carts and were about to hand them to Zhou Qin, but they saw that this extremely beautiful and slim woman had already walked far away. They watched as Zhou Qin walked into the extremely cold snowfield of the Qinghai Tibet Plateau in a thin shirt and headed for Kari Holy Mountain. Her speed was simply not that of a mortal. They all turned over and got out of the car in shock. Looking at Zhou Qin's disappearing figure, they murmured and worshipped her. Zhou Qin had trudged all the way here, and she had suffered much more than what Li Yundong had suffered at the beginning. At this time her temperament had changed dramatically. In the past, Zhou Qin gave people a feeling of indifference, reservation, pride, and conceit. She was like a noble and proud swan that people could not get close to. After a long journey, the qi in her body had been refined thousands of times, condensing like molten steel. When it surged, it was as vigorous and blazing as lava. When it solidified, it was as hard and indestructible as pig iron. There was an indomitable fortitude between her eyebrows, like a peerless sword that was about to be unsheathed and would ring at any time. Ruan Hongling and Zi Yuan, who had been following Zhou Qin from afar along the way, were both staring at Zhou Qin. Although they had not observed Zhou Qin up close, they could feel that the powerful energy contained in Zhou Qin's body was no less than that of Li Yunyang. At this time, Zhou Qin had not yet reached the Zhuji phase, so she did not know how to hide or restrain her strength. Therefore, wherever she went, there were thick clouds above her head. There seemed to be a pair of majestic eyes hidden in the clouds, staring at her every move. Ruan Hongling looked at Zhou Qin's figure and couldn't help but sigh. I didn't expect her to persist all the way. It's incredible. I saw her crying secretly at night a few times. At that time I thought she would give up, but I didn't expect that she would insist on going on the road again the next day. For a daughter of a rich family like her, this is really rare. Amazing, really amazing. Zi Yuan also sighed with a smile. Yes, the fragrance of plum blossoms comes from the bitter cold, and the edge of the sword is sharpened. This sword is about to be sharpened to the world. Ruan Hongling looked at Zhou Qin enviously. I really envy her. She is a good furnace, a good opportunity, a good master, good luck, and a good temperament. She was born to be a cultivator. However, Zi Yuan shook her head slightly and said solemnly to Ruan Hongling, No Hongling, no one in this world is born to cultivate. If Zhou Qin did not have this perseverance, it would have been impossible for her to persist on the road to Zhuji phase. Even you have not experienced the arduous cultivation of trekking 2,000 kilometers to Tibet. Ruan Hongling snorted and said with some dissatisfaction, If I wanted Rinyuan Jindan, I could do it too. Zi Yuan glared at Ruan Hongling and was about to scold her when she suddenly saw Ruan Hongling's eyes widen. She pointed to Zhou Qin's voice in the distance and said, Look, what's wrong with her? Zi Yuan looked in the direction of her finger and saw that at this time, Zhou Qin was standing in the endless snowfield like a statue, motionless. After a long time, her body moved slightly, as if she had reluctantly sat down cross-legged. As soon as she sat down, she seemed to have entered a meditative state and was motionless. Ruan Hongling said in surprise, Is she going to Zhuji phase now? Zi Yuan frowned. She bit her lip gently and said in a deep voice, Damn it, Zhou Qin is a Shenin virgin furnace. There is Shenin qi and Yuanyang qi in her body. She is also a reconstructed body of Jindan. It can be said that she has the most perfect cultivation conditions in cultivation, but she doesn't know how to control her qi. At this time, the qi in her body is boiling and uncontrollable, forcing her to build the Zhuji phase here. Ruan Hongling smiled bitterly. No way. It's not easy to get to the foot of the holy mountain and she's actually going to Zhuji phase? What's the difference between this and a pregnant woman who is about to go to the hospital and her water breaking? Zi Yuan found Ruan Hongling's analogy interesting. She couldn't help but smile bitterly and say, Although your words are a little vulgar, the analogy is very appropriate. For us cultivators, Zhuji phase is indeed like giving birth to a child. Ordinary people give birth to children, but we produce Niden in our dantian. Moreover, you don't know when Niden will suddenly jump out. Ruan Hongling asked Zi Yuan, What should we do now? It's not a good thing for Zhou Qin to build the Zhuji phase on this vast plateau. What if someone suddenly comes and disturbs her at this time? Zi Yuan sighed helplessly. We can only protect her from being attacked by bad people along the way, but we can't interfere with her cultivation. Even if she fails to build the Zhuji phase, we can't interfere. Otherwise, once she understands that someone will protect her on the way to the Zhuji phase, she will subconsciously develop a sense of dependence. Once a cultivator develops this kind of dependence, she will be crippled. She will never be able to build the Zhuji phase again in this life. Yuan Hongling was shocked. Then are we just going to watch her build the Zhuji phase here? Ziyuan sighed and said, there's no other way. This is her fate. Let's see if she can succeed in building the Zhuji phase. Even if she fails, she can do it again. The two of them looked at Zhou Qin worriedly. Although they were not very close to Zhou Qin, they had seen her struggle along the way, and they didn't want her to fail at this last moment. At this time, Zhou Qin's heart was also full of helplessness. She had wanted to climb to the mountainside of the snowy mountain in front of her and build the Zhuji phase like Li Yundong. But she hadn't expected that as soon as she climbed the vast snowy plateau, she would feel her heart open up. The aura all over her body seemed to be drawn by the qi of heaven and earth, surging uncontrollably and fiercely. At first, Zhou Qin didn't pay much attention, but as she ran further, the aura in her body became more and more intense. In the end, Zhou Qin clearly felt that the aura all over her body was like a big vortex, crazily rushing toward the lower dantian of her lower abdomen. It was as if there was an extra whirlpool there, and the center of the whirlpool was the place where Niden was about to be formed. Although the environment was not good at this time, Zhou Qin did not dare to hold on anymore. She knew that if she did, all the meridians in her body would explode. She did not dare to be careless. She immediately sat down cross-legged and fell into a deep meditation. Just as Zhou Qin was in meditation, it suddenly began to snow. The flying snow on the Qinghai Tibet Plateau was as big as a goose feather. In just a short while, Zhou Qin's body seemed to be covered with a thick layer of white felt. But at this time the aura in Zhou Qin's body was flowing. A stream of cold Xianyin qi rushed from her left kidney to her lower dantian, and another stream of hot Yuanyang qi rushed from her right kidney to her lower dantian. When the two auras collided, they immediately vibrated and rubbed against each other, producing a blazing aura. Gradually, Zhou Qin could feel that this aura was getting stronger and hotter. There seemed to be an invisible fireball rolling quickly in her lower abdomen. The heat continued to evaporate and quickly melted the snow on Zhou Qin's body. However, when the snow turned into water and slid down her body, new flying snow covered it again. In this way the snow melted and piled up repeatedly. Soon, a thin layer of ice formed on Zhou Qin's body, and her whole body was like a sculpture covered in ice armor. Ziyuan and Yuan Hongling in the distance were worried. Ziyuan frowned and said, "Oh no, Zhou Qin should find a place to take shelter from the wind and snow. The true fire in her body is too strong, and it is constantly melting the snow, causing the cold qi to penetrate her body through her pores. Even if she can successfully build the Zhuji phase, there will be a lot of moisture and cold qi left, which will be detrimental to her future cultivation. Building the Zhuji phase like this is not worth it." Yuan Hongling was also worried and said, "Sister Ziyuan, shall we go and interrupt her Zhuji phase? I'd rather let her fail this time than leave a root of her illness." "No. I'd rather leave a root of her illness than let her develop a dependence from now on." Ziyuan gritted her teeth and shouted resolutely, "It's easy to cure external diseases, but difficult to cure internal diseases." Yuan Hongling looked at Zhou Qin and sighed with a wry smile. "I originally thought that this girl had always been lucky, but I didn't expect such a thing to happen at such a critical moment." Alas. While she was sighing with emotion, she suddenly heard a melodious and sweet song coming from the white snowfield. First, it's best not to see each other so that we won't fall in love. Second, it's best not to know each other so that we won't miss each other. Third, it's best not to accompany each other so that we won't owe each other anything. Fourth, it's best not to cherish each other so that we won't remember each other. Fifth, it's best not to love each other so that we won't abandon each other. This song was sung by a woman. Her voice was clear and melodious like a silver bell, and it was beautiful like the flowing water at the foot of the Tangula Mountains. Especially this song revealed a strand of dense yearning and pain of yearning, and it was melancholic and sorrowful, causing the hearts of those who heard it to fluctuate and be moved. Ziyuan and Yuan Hongling hadn't expected that such a moving song would suddenly come from the vast snowfield of Qinghai Tibet. They suddenly felt as if a thin string had been gently plucked in their hearts, and they were a little dazed for a moment. Especially Ziyuan. For some reason, Li Yundong's figure suddenly appeared in her mind, which made her heart tremble slightly for a moment. For a moment the world was extremely quiet. Only this beautiful voice came through the howling wind and snow. This song seemed to represent the purest and most beautiful thing in the world, and even the merciless wind and snow could not stop it. The two young women looked into the distance at the same time, as if they wanted to see clearly who was singing such a sorrowful and moving song, and who was tugging at the strings of their hearts. To quickly find this site, please search on Baidu Sanlian Literature website. Chapter 456. Go to Canwang. Heavy snowflakes fluttered in the boundless sky. The world seemed to be boundless. In this boundless snowfield, a team slowly walked out. Go to Canwang. Most of the team was made up of wooden carts pulled by yaks and extremely cold-resistant highland horses. Some of the Tibetans in Tibetan clothes had wrapped themselves tightly, leaving only a pair of eyes exposed. Some old Tibetans were sitting on wooden carts pulled by yaks, turning the prayer wheel and walking slowly all the way. In this team there was a girl riding on a yak. Although the snowstorm was very heavy at this time, she was still singing to her heart's content, as if she wanted the wind and snow to send her voice far, far away, all the way to the ears of her lover, bringing her pain of longing and lovesickness. None of the Tibetans in this team spoke. They all seemed to be quietly listening to the girls singing. Everyone's face was full of emotion and remembrance, as if they were recalling their own emotional memories. When the team was not far from Zhou Qin, the leading Tibetan suddenly shouted, "Changbajila, look, look! There seems to be someone." The leading Tibetan was Uncle Changbajila, who Li Yundong had saved when he was in the Zhuji phase. At this time he was returning from the Kari Holy Mountain with his clansmen, but they met Li Yundong's disciple Zhou Qin on the way back. When Changbajila heard the shouts of his clansmen, he took a closer look and saw a figure sitting cross-legged on the side of the road. Her whole body was frozen and she was motionless. Changbajila sighed softly and said, "I'm afraid she's frozen to death." By the time he had finished speaking, the girl who was singing had already stopped singing. She spurred her horse to stand in front of Changbajila. Her delicate face was full of sorrow, and there was a touch of haggardness in her big watery eyes. The girl was Meiduo. She asked softly, "Changbajila, what's wrong?" Changbajila raised his horsewhip, pointed at Zhou Qin on the side of the road and sighed. "Poor thing, she's frozen to death." As he spoke, he turned around and shouted at his clansmen, "Go and carry him into the carriage. When the snow stops, we'll find a good place to bury him." Meiduo curiously looked at the frozen passerby by the roadside. She saw that the passerby was dressed differently from the Tibetans. He looked like a Han from the mainland. Ever since Meiduo had met Li Yundong and fallen in love with him, she had developed a special affection for the Han people. She grabbed Changbajila and whispered, "Changbajila, let me go. Maybe this Han brother is not dead yet." Changbajila looked at Meiduo. He seemed to know what she was thinking, so he couldn't help but sigh to himself. He thought to himself, "Are you kidding me? In this world of ice and snow, wearing such little clothes can freeze people to death in less than 5 minutes, let alone with such a thick layer of ice all over her body." However, Changbajila still stopped Meiduo and said, "Well, Meiduo, go and have a look. But be careful not to touch the ice with your hands or you'll freeze." Meiduo smiled slightly and said, "Changbajila, I know. I'm not a child anymore." Changbajila looked at Meiduo and couldn't help but sigh in a low voice. "Alas, you are indeed not a child. Our Meiduo's heart is no longer in the snow mountain." Meiduo rode her horse forward to Zhou Qin's side. She jumped down gently and bent down to take a look. What she saw shocked her. She saw that the person wearing a layer of ice armor turned out to be a beautiful Han sister. What surprised her even more was that although this woman's whole body had been frozen, her cheeks were still rosy. This Han sister is really still alive? Meiduo was shocked. She subconsciously reached out and gently probed the woman's nose. However, she found that the woman was not breathing at all. Meiduo couldn't help but be confused again. She thought to herself, "What's going on? If she's frozen to death, how can her face still be so rosy? But if she's still alive, why isn't she breathing?" Not far away, Changbajila saw that Meiduo was staring at Zhou Qin in a daze and didn't respond. He couldn't help shouting, "Meiduo, what's going on?" Meiduo turned her face and shouted, "Changbajila, I don't know either. This Han sister doesn't seem to be dead, but she seems to be dead again." Changbajila couldn't help laughing. "Meiduo, you silly child. How can a person seem to be dead and not dead at the same time? If she's dead, she's dead. If she's not dead, she's not dead." With a strange look on her face, Meiduo shouted, "Changbajila, come and see for yourself." Changbajila smiled and shook his head. He spurred his horse forward, turned over and took a look. Even though he was experienced and knowledgeable, he couldn't help but be shocked. He exclaimed, "This is really strange." Changbajila also probed Zhou Qin's nose with his hand and became even more shocked. "What's going on? Why is her face obviously rosy but she's not breathing? Meiduo looked at Zhou Qin curiously. She stared intently for a while and found that the blood vessels under the delicate white skin of Zhou Qin's neck seemed to be moving slightly. Meiduo suddenly exclaimed, "She's still alive. I can see her blood vessels beating." After that, Meiduo reached out to touch Zhou Qin's face, as if she wanted to confirm her words. But as soon as Meiduo's hand touched Zhou Qin, her whole body shook. The powerful aura in Zhou Qin's body instantly poured into her body. Meiduo's whole body suddenly shook, just like how Zhou Qin had touched Li Yundong, who was in the process of building the Zhuji phase. She was pulled into Zhou Qin's spirit space. In a trance, Meiduo felt that she was in a bustling modern metropolis. She was like a bystander looking through Zhou Qin's experience from childhood to adulthood, watching the growth of this rich girl bit by bit. Meiduo had watched Zhou Qin grow up from an eccentric and stubborn child to a proud and conceited young lady. She had also watched Zhou Qin meet Li Yundong on campus, who had confessed his love for her, and Zhou Qin had rejected him without any consideration for his feelings. At first, Meiduo had thought that Li Yundong, who had not yet obtained the Renyuan Jindan, looked familiar. She hadn't recognized that this loser, who had been a little fat before, was her Han brother. But when Meiduo saw Li Yundong, who had taken the Renyuan Jindan and had been reborn, she couldn't help but exclaim in her heart, "Ah, this is the Han brother. Why is he here? Does this Han sister also know the Han brother? Ah, by the way, the Han brother once told me that he used to love a girl deeply. Is this Han sister the girl he loved deeply? Is her name Su-chan?" For Meiduo, Su-chan was really an unforgettable name. It was for this girl that the Han brother had finally rejected her. With this question in mind, Meiduo continued to quietly watch the scenes that flashed quickly in Zhou Qin's spirit space. She looked at the bits and pieces of Li Yundong in the depths of Zhou Qin's memory. She watched as the boy was sometimes majestic and sometimes humorous. Sometimes Meiduo admired and yearned for him. Sometimes she was amused and giggled, trembling with laughter. It turns out that the Han brother is such an interesting person. Meiduo looked at everything in front of her with a smile on her face. She couldn't help but feel tenderness in her heart. She murmured in a daze, "I really envy this Han sister for being so happy with the Han brother." But soon, Meiduo discovered that in Zhou Qin's memory, there was always another girl by Li Yundong's side. This girl was extremely beautiful, so beautiful that even women were envious and jealous of her. She always snuggled up to Li Yundong like a little bird, incomparably affectionate. When Meiduo saw this, she couldn't help but wonder in her heart, is this Han sister not Su-chan? Is this extremely beautiful girl the Han sister? Soon, Meiduo saw Li Yundong mobilize heavenly thunder to strike young Master He angrily, especially when he said, "If heaven doesn't take you, I will." The girl's eyes were filled with tears, and she was so excited that she couldn't control herself. Meiduo bit her lip tightly and shouted crazily in her heart, "This is a real hero, this is a real hero. This is the Han brother I love." But soon, when Meiduo saw that Li Yundong had no choice but to separate from Su-chan, she finally couldn't hold back the tears in her eyes. At this moment she felt the love between Li Yundong and Su-chan. It was so deep that others couldn't even bear to break them up. It turns out that the Han brother also has such a tender side. Meiduo suddenly felt that she had come into contact with the real Li Yundong, a Li Yundong who was heroic and gentle at the same time. After an unknown period of time, Meiduo woke up from Zhou Qin's spirit space. When she came to her senses, she found that her clansmen were all surrounding her, looking at her in surprise and nervousness. Chengbajila stared at Meiduo with his eyes wide open and asked tentatively, "Meiduo, are you okay?" Meiduo blinked and found that the corners of her eyes were cold. She raised her hand to wipe them, only to find that she had inadvertently burst into tears. The tears that flowed down her cheeks had quickly turned into sparkling ice crystals. Meiduo smiled and said to Chengbajila, "I'm fine." Chengbajila pointed to the frozen tears on Meiduo's face and asked in surprise, "Why were you crying just now?" Meiduo smiled and said, "Was I crying?" "Chengbajila, you must have seen it wrong. I was smiling." The expression on Chengbajila's face became even more strange. He asked, "Then what were you smiling about?" Meiduo smiled gently and said, I was smiling. I really have never missed a person in love. This Han brother is really worthy of love." Hearing this, Chengbajila smiled bitterly in his heart. This Meiduo is really crazy. She is beyond cure. Her soul has been taken away by the Han brother. Even the living Buddha can't call her soul back now. Meiduo said in a daze, "Chengbajila, I've decided. I'm going to Tianan City to find him. I'm going to his school." Chengbajila smiled bitterly and said, Meiduo, you've said this to Shuashan Mountain and God of Heaven 10,000 times. What can you do even if you go to him? Don't tell me you want to separate him and his lover? Nothing. I just want to see him from a distance and I'll be very satisfied. Meiduo rolled her eyes and giggled. There was a different kind of brilliance between her eyebrows. At this moment, Zhou Qin faintly woke up and let out a cry. Meiduo was overjoyed and exclaimed, "Oh, Han's sister is awake." See. Chapter 457. Go to watch net. When Meiduo saw that Zhou Qin had woken up, she cheered in surprise. The surrounding Tibetans also gathered around curiously and couldn't help sighing. It's really a blessing from God. She actually came back to life. Chengbajila turned around and waved his hand, shouting, "Quick, bring the Highland barley wine. Let her drink some to warm her body. Go to watch net." 7 km. Soon, a young Tibetan brought over a warm cowhide bag and wanted to give it to Zhou Qin to drink. However, they saw that Zhou Qin was extremely beautiful. Although she was wearing a thin coat, in this cold and snowy land, her face was cold and rosy. The Tibetans were extremely shocked, and the young Tibetan holding the Highland barley wine was even more shocked by Zhou Qin's beauty. He didn't dare to step forward and offend her, so he handed the Highland barley wine to Meiduo. Meiduo took it with a smile and enthusiastically put the mouth of the cowhide bag to Zhou Qin's mouth, saying, "You must be cold. Drink some Highland barley wine to warm your body." At this time, Zhou Qin had just woken up from her meditation. As soon as she opened her eyes, she saw a group of people dressed in Tibetan clothes surrounding her. In front of her, a beautiful Tibetan girl was holding a cowhide bag in her hand and looking at her in surprise. Zhou Qin was stunned for a moment. She had walked all the way to the Zhuji phase and she was a beautiful young single woman. On the way, she had met countless villains who wanted to take advantage of her. Therefore, Zhou Qin's vigilance was extremely strong. She looked at the cowhide bag warily, leaned back slightly and shouted in a low voice, "Who are you?" Seeing that Zhou Qin was looking at her with hostility and vigilance, she couldn't help but feel anxious. She blurted out in Tibetan, "You fainted on the side of the road. We saw you and thought you were dead. We didn't expect you to be alive. Now that you have woken up, we want you to drink a mouthful of Highland barley wine to warm your body. There's no other meaning. Please rest assured we are all good people." As she spoke, Meiduo turned around and pointed to her people, saying, "This is the Highland barley wine made by Ram. The wine he makes is mellow and tastes good. You will definitely feel warm after drinking it." Zhou Qin saw that Meiduo was talking to her anxiously. She didn't understand why this girl was so enthusiastic about her, so she became more and more vigilant. Zhou Qin moved, and the ice armor on her body broke one after another, falling down with a clattering sound. Some of the ice stuck to her clothes was also brushed off by Zhou Qin with a faint expression. When the Tibetans saw that such a slender and weak woman was wearing so few clothes, up in the cold and snowy land, they couldn't help but feel even more awe in their hearts. They couldn't help but feel even more respect. Seeing that Zhou Qin was ignoring her, Meiduo was stunned and thought to herself, "Why is this Han sister ignoring me? Ah, that's right, she definitely doesn't understand my words." Meiduo immediately repeated what she had just said to Zhou Qin in Chinese. After hearing this, Zhou Qin smiled faintly and said to Meiduo, "Thank you for your kindness, but I'm not cold. I don't need to drink this. Also, thank you for saving me. I'm fine." After that, Zhou Qin patted off the ice on her body and prepared to turn around and continue walking toward Kari Holy Mountain. Zhou Qin's indifference stunned the Tibetans. They looked at each other and were speechless. They had never met such an unreasonable person before. However, most of the Tibetans saw that Zhou Qin's clothes were thin, and the corners of her clothes were fluttering in the cold wind. Her face was as red as usual and she was extremely beautiful. Her posture and temperament revealed a sense of arrogance and coldness. Not only did they not think that Zhou Qin was rude, but they also felt that a person like her should have such a posture and attitude. Meiduo watched Zhou Qin walk away step by step. She stood there for a long time with the Highland barley wine in her hand. It was not until Zhou Qin's figure slowly disappeared into the wind and snow that she couldn't help shouting in Chinese, "Sister, do you know Li Yundong?" This shout immediately stopped Zhou Qin's figure. Zhou Qin turned around abruptly, looked at Meiduo in surprise and shouted, "How do you know him?" Meiduo ran over quickly and said in surprise, "Sister Han, do you really know him? What's your name?" Zhou Qin frowned slightly and didn't answer. Instead she asked, "What's your name?" Meiduo didn't care about Zhou Qin's attitude. She said with a smile, "My name is Meiduo. What about you?" When Zhou Qin heard this name she was stunned. She immediately remembered that Li Yundong had once mentioned Meiduo, a girl from the Tibetan family, when they were chatting. However, she also knew that many Tibetan people had similar names, so she didn't dare to be careless. She asked with a smile, "How do you know Li Yundong?" When Meiduo heard her mention Li Yundong, she couldn't help but show a trace of tenderness in the corners of her eyes. She said softly, "When I first saw him, I only thought that he was dirty and sloppy. By the way, he also saved Changbajila's life." Hearing this, Zhou Qin no longer had any doubts. The vigilance on her face disappeared, and a smile appeared on her face. "So it's you. I've heard of you." Meiduo couldn't help but clap her hands and say with a smile, "Do you really know him? Oh, what a coincidence." As she said this, Meiduo turned around and waved at Changbajila. "Changbajila, this Han's sister really knows Li Yundong. Come here quickly." Changbajila immediately walked over to Zhou Qin and said with joy, "Han's sister, who are you to Li Yundong? Are you his girlfriend?" A trace of sadness flashed across Zhou Qin's eyes. She formed a palm with one hand, made a Taoist salute and said, "Amitba, I am his disciple." Changbajila was stunned for a moment, but he quickly smiled again and said, "No wonder, no wonder. Last time I saw him fight with amazing skills, I thought that he was definitely not an ordinary person. I didn't expect it to be like this. Today when I saw you, I realized that Yuhan people say, a great teacher produces a great disciple. The sentence really makes sense. Only someone as capable as him can teach such a powerful disciple like you." Changbajila asked, "Han's sister, did you come here to cultivate?" Zhou Qin nodded slightly. "Yes, it's a pity that I encountered a setback halfway and almost ruined my cultivation." Changbajila gave her a thumbs up. "I've lived for decades, but this is the first time I've seen a young and beautiful girl like you who dares to go out alone. What's more, you came to carry Holy Mountain to cultivate in such a small dress in this season. Amazing, really amazing. The people of the Central Plains are really amazing." When Zhou Qin heard the Tibetan man in front of her praise her, she smiled slightly and said reservedly, "Actually, it's nothing. It's all thanks to you. If you hadn't appeared, I'm afraid I would have been in trouble." Meiduo said with a smile, "Then how are you going to thank us?" Zhou Qin glanced at Meiduo with a smile. "If you have any requests, just tell me. If I can do it, I will definitely do it." Neither Meiduo nor Changbajila knew Zhou Qin's identity and background, and they didn't know that her words were enough to change the lives of one person or even many people. Changbajila glared at Meiduo and shouted, "Meiduo, how can you ask a distinguished guest for a favor? Hurry up and apologize." Meiduo pouted and made a face at Changbajila. "You're so annoying. I'm not making any excessive demands." As she said this, she turned to Zhou Qin and said with a smile, "I'll just ask you a few questions. If you answer me, you'll repay us." Hearing this, Changbajila was relieved. He pretended to be angry and glared at Meiduo, then scolded her with a smile, "Since when can you represent all of us?" Meiduo didn't seem to hear Changbajila's words. She just stared at Zhou Qin without blinking, her eyes full of expectation. "Can I, Han's sister?" Zhou Qin looked at the Tibetan girl and felt that her eyes were so pure that there was not a trace of blemish in them. They were like the holy Namso lake, so clear that one could almost see to the bottom at a glance. Zhou Qin saw this and thought to herself, "What a lovely Tibetan girl. No wonder Master mentioned her to me several times after he went back." Zhou Qin replied with a smile, "Of course. Go ahead." Meiduo was delighted and said with a smile, "Then I'll ask the first question first. Han's sister, what's your name? Is it Su Chan?" Zhou Qin smiled and shook her head. "No, my name is Zhou Qin." "Su Chan is the name of another girl." Meiduo immediately asked, "Then, do you know this girl named Su Chan? Is she Li Yundong's lover?" Zhou Qin sighed softly in her heart, then nodded and said, "Yes." Meiduo let out a cry, and the expression on her face was a little complicated. She asked again, "Well, can I ask you another question?" Zhou Qin smiled slightly and said, "Okay, but I also have a question to ask you later." Meiduo laughed and said, "Okay, then Sister Zhou Qin, why don't you ask first?" Zhou Qin thought for a moment and asked bluntly, "Where did you come from? Why did my master meet you when he came here, and why did I meet you here?" When Meiduo heard this, she and Changbajila looked at each other. They knew that there was still a trace of doubt in Zhou Qin's heart, so they all laughed. Changbajila explained with a smile, "Han's sister, we go to carry Holy Mountain to worship every 4 years. Last time we met a Han brother in the process of going to the Holy Mountain. You know, we are all in ox carts and carriages, and when we see a temple we will worship and move forward. Takes a lot of time on the way. So it took us more than a month to come back from Carry Holy Mountain. We are going back to our hometown. Only then did Zhou Qin understand. She smiled apologetically and said, I'm really sorry. I'm a little suspicious. Cheng Bajila waved his hand and said with a hearty smile, it's okay. If a young and beautiful girl like you isn't vigilant, it's easy for you to meet bad people. Meduo also smiled and said, Han's sister, can you answer my question now? Zhou Qin smiled and said, go ahead. Meduo asked nervously, if I go to the university that Han brother goes to, do you think I can get in? When Zhou Qin heard this, she felt as if her heart had been overturned. She had all kinds of feelings. She thought bitterly in her heart, Li Yundong, you are really a peerless lover. You love people everywhere. Not only did you make me suffer, but you also hurt such an innocent and lovely Tibetan girl. A wry smile appeared at the corner of Zhou Qin's mouth. For a moment, she didn't know how to answer the innocent girl in front of her. Just as she didn't know how to answer, there was suddenly a tinkling sound in the wind and snow. It sounded like camel bells, but also like the sound of Tibetan people turning sutras. When Cheng Bajila and Meduo heard the sound, they were stunned at the same time and turned their heads to look into the wind and snow. They saw a team slowly walking out of the wind and snow. There were about a dozen people in the team, each riding a yak or a two-humped camel. Meduo asked curiously, camels? Aren't they only found near Lhasa? Why are there people riding camels here? Cheng Bajila took a closer look at the team. He saw that all the people in the team were dressed in red and yellow Buddhist robes, and the man sitting on the two-humped camels was wearing a long yellow feather hat on his head. Cheng Bajila exclaimed and said in surprise, is this the team of the living Buddha? What are they doing out here? At this time, Meduo also saw that the young monk at the head of the team was Dorji Tenzin, whom she knew. She couldn't help waving her arm and shouting, Dorji Tenzin, it's me Meduo. When Dorji Tenzin saw Meduo, he was also very surprised. He turned around and talked to the older monk behind him for a while, then pushed the head of the yak aside and slowly walked toward Meduo. When Dorji Tenzin came closer, she asked with a smile, Dorji Tenzin, what are you doing out here in such a heavy snowstorm? Dorji Tenzin looked at Zhou Qin curiously, then said to Meduo with a smile, Panchen Lama living Buddha said that the auspicious goddess has come to the world and asked us to come out to find the Buddha. Sorry, I forgot to update last night. I'll make it up this morning. Chapter 458. Go to the net. Lakshmi has come to the world? Meduo and Cheng Bajila shouted in surprise at the same time. Go to the net. 7 KOM. Dorji Tenzin smiled and said, yes, this is great news. Meduo asked in confusion, but, Dorji Tenzin, aren't you the guardian Vajra of the Kathoda temple? Why are you helping the living Buddha find the Lakshmi? Dorji Tenzin smiled slightly and didn't say anything. A monk beside him said with a smile, now Dorji Tenzin has been transferred to the Vajra sacred mountain and has become one of the 18 mountain protecting monks. Meduo and Cheng Bajila were overjoyed at the same time and said, this is great news. The Kathoda temple has a mountain protecting monk of the sacred mountain. This is a great thing. Dorji Tenzin's face was neither sad nor happy. He saluted and said with a smile, this is the favor of the living Buddha. I just happened to be there. Meduo smiled and said, why don't you tell me how it happened? Dorji Tenzin sighed slightly and said, speaking of which, I have to thank Li Yundong. At that time, he returned the Mahamudra secret method sutra of the Kathoda temple. When I returned to the Kathoda temple with the sutra, the abbot was overjoyed and recommended me to meet the living Buddha. When the living Buddha saw me, he said that I had the root of wisdom and opportunity, so he kept me by his side and made me a mountain guardian monk. Meduo smiled and said, that's too much of a coincidence. Dorji Tenzin, do you know who this is? As she spoke, she pointed to Zhou Qin beside her. Dorji Tenzin had been paying attention to Zhou Qin. In his eyes, Zhou Qin's aura was incredibly strong and exuberant, and she was dressed like a Han person. Dorji Tenzin had only seen such a powerful Han person from Li Yundong. Dorji Tenzin put his palms together and asked, I don't know. Meduo, please introduce her to me. Meduo said with a smile, this is Li Yundong's disciple. Her name is Zhou Qin. Dorji Tenzin's eyes lit up and he couldn't help but laugh. Ah, it turns out to be Grand Master Li's disciple. Sure enough, a famous teacher produces a brilliant disciple. The master is a handsome figure in the Central Plains, and the disciple is also so outstanding. I admire you. Zhou Qin had also heard Li Yundong mention Dorji Tenzin. She also smiled and returned the greeting with the Taoist etiquette. She smiled and said, "Master Dorji Tenzin, you flatter me. Although my master's cultivation is amazing, I believe he doesn't deserve the title of Grandmaster." Dorji Tenzin smiled and said, "Although I am not a Grandmaster now, I will definitely be one in the future. Moreover, I don't dare to accept your title of Master." Zhou Qin also pursed her lips and smiled. "Even if you're not a master now, you'll definitely be one in the future." After saying that, they all laughed out loud. When Meiduo saw that Zhou Qin and Dorji Tenzin were talking happily, she smiled and said, "I remember that there was a poem in the book of the Han people that said, 'It's a small world.' I think it's a bit like that now. Sister Han, don't leave tonight. Drink and sing with us." Tibetans were warm and hospitable. When they met a guest they liked, they would warmly urge them to stay and sing and dance with them in the evening. Zhou Qin shook her head with a smile and declined Meiduo's kindness. She said, "I'm going to carry Holy Mountain to cultivate. I'll drink your highland barley wine when I have the chance in the future." Meiduo was disappointed. "Ah, can't you stay tonight? Sister Han, it's almost night. Do you know how cold it is here at night? Don't leave tonight. Stay in my tent for the night. I have a lot to say to you." As she spoke, Meiduo couldn't help but take Zhou Qin's hand and shake it gently, begging in a low voice. Although Zhou Qin's character was firm and strong, when she saw Meiduo pleading so pitifully, she really couldn't bear to refuse her. Her heart softened and she was about to sigh secretly when she suddenly heard the sound of the bell of the scripture tube not far away. A magnetic voice said, "Dorji Tenzin, call Meiduo to me." Dorji Tenzin looked back and saw a yellow-crowned lama sitting on a double-humped camel nodding at him. Dorji Tenzin smiled at Meiduo and said, "Meiduo, Master Erdini wants to see you." Meiduo was slightly surprised. "Ah, is that Master Erdini of Padala Palace?" Dorji Tenzin smiled and said, "Yes." Meiduo was immediately surprised. She tidied up her clothes in a panic and said, "Why does the master want to see me?" Changbajila looked at Meiduo enviously and said, "Meiduo, you are so lucky to be summoned by Master Erdini. I've only seen him from afar when I was on a pilgrimage in my life." Meiduo became more and more nervous. She tidied herself up several times and still asked Zhou Qin worriedly, "Sister Han, do you think I'm okay?" Although Zhou Qin didn't know the status of Master Erdini in the hearts of the Tibetans, she knew that he must be an extraordinary person. She smiled and comforted her. "Meiduo, piety is not in your clothes but in your heart." In the distance, Master Erdini also clearly heard Zhou Qin's words. He looked at Zhou Qin with appreciation and said with a smile, "You're right. Meiduo, come here. I'm not a vulture. I don't eat people." The monks who followed him all laughed, and Meiduo's heart was also shaken. She boldly walked up to Erdini and blinked her eyes curiously at the master of Padala Palace. Master Erdini looked at Meiduo carefully, nodded to himself and smiled kindly. "Meiduo, when were you born?" Meiduo was a little confused but she still gave him her name. Master Erdini pinched his fingers and calculated silently in his heart. Then he smiled at Meiduo and said, "Meiduo, come closer." Meiduo took 2 steps forward curiously, only to see Master Erdini hand her the prayer wheel in his hand. He smiled kindly and said, "Meiduo, take this and see if you can spin it." Meiduo smiled and said, "What's so difficult about it? Isn't this something that everyone can do?" Dorji Tenzin couldn't help but interject with a smile, "Meiduo, you don't know. Do you know what you're holding in your hand?" Meiduo blinked and said, "Isn't it just a hand mani wheel? What's so strange about that?" The Tibetans called the hand-cranked prayer wheel the mani wheel. Almost every devout believer of Tibetan Buddhism had one. The Tibetans firmly believed that turning the prayer wheel would give them merit. Turning it once was equivalent to reciting the Tripitaka once. Turning it twice was equivalent to reciting all the Buddhist scriptures. Turning it 3 times could eliminate the hindrances of one's body, mouth, mind, and sins. Turning it 10 times could eliminate the hindrances of sins like Mount Sumeru. Turning it 100 times could make one's merit equal to that of King Yama. Turning it 1,000 times could allow all living beings to attain Dharmakaya. Turning it 10,000 times could allow all living beings to be liberated. Turning it 100,000 times could allow the Bodhisattva Guanyin to meet the saints. Turning it 1,000,000 times could allow all living beings in the 6 paths of samsara to be at peace and happiness. Turning it 1,000,000 times could allow all living beings in the 6 paths of samsara to be free from the sea of suffering. Although Meiduo's words were naive, they were not without reason. The monks and lamas around all laughed. Dorji Tenzin said with a smile, "Meiduo, you have Erdini's personal mani wheel in your hand. Only people with great merit and dharma power can spin it. Ordinary people can't spin it no matter how hard they spin it. Meduo was shocked. She quickly looked at the prayer wheel in her hand and saw that it was made of pure gold. The cylinder was engraved with the six-word mantra of Tibetan Buddhism, and the middle of the cylinder was also engraved with mantras. Around the mantras were also engraved with exquisite patterns of birds and beasts. These birds and beasts were painted with colorful paint and inlaid with corals and gems. At a glance, one could tell that they were not ordinary objects. Meduo felt that the prayer wheel in her hand was heavy. She couldn't help but raise her head and say to Erdini eagerly, "Master Erdini, I'm afraid I can't do it. Please, please don't turn it, lest I make a fool of myself." Erdini laughed and waved his hand. "It's okay. Go ahead." Seeing Erdini smiling kindly at her, Meduo's courage slowly grew. She thought to herself, "I'll turn it." She gently shook the prayer wheel, and the golden bells on the prayer wheel began to move slowly. After a while, the prayer wheel began to turn and emitted a clear sound. Meduo giggled and said, "Haha, I'm turning it, I'm turning it. I'm also a person with great merit and power." Dorji Tenzin and the other monks were all shocked. They stared at Meduo with their mouths agape, unable to say a word. They thought in shock, "It's impossible. When I turned Master Erdini's mani wheel, I used all my strength, but this prayer wheel didn't turn." Dorji Tenzin looked at Erdini and stammered, "Master, what's going on?" Erdini's face turned solemn. He jumped down from the back of the camel and knelt down in the snow with great devotion. He kowtowed to Meduo and shouted loudly, "I finally found you, Banda Lamb." Zhou Qin, who was not far away, was stunned by his kowtow and shout. However, in the eyes of the other Tibetans, it was no less than the explosion of an atomic bomb. All the Tibetans were stunned. They stared at Meduo, who was also stunned. Some of them stammered, "No, it can't be. Meduo is Banda Lamb?" Changbajila's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. He couldn't help but say, "That's impossible, right? Master Erdini must have made a mistake, right? How could Meduo be Banda Lamb?" As soon as he shouted, the other Tibetans who were on good terms with Meduo were all shocked. Yes, how could Meduo be Banda Lamb? Dorji Tenzin also whispered to Erdini in shock, "Master, could it be that you've made a mistake?" However, Erdini turned a deaf ear to him. After 3 kowtows and 9 kowtows, he stood up and patted the snow off his body. He respectfully extended his hand to Meduo and said, "Banda Lamb, please give me the mani wheel." At this time, Meduo seemed to have lost her ability to think. She handed the prayer wheel in her hand to Erdini in a daze. After Erdini respectfully took it with both hands, he turned to look at Dorji Tenzin and said, "Why don't you turn it around?" Dorji Tenzin immediately took a step back and said, "Master, I don't have great merit and power. Of course I can't turn it." Erdini nodded and walked over to Changbajila. "Why don't you turn it around?" Changbajila swallowed hard. He looked at Meduo, gritted his teeth and picked up the prayer wheel. However, no matter how hard he tried, the prayer wheel was like a piece of pig iron. He couldn't turn it no matter how hard he tried. After shaking it for a long time, Changbajila handed the prayer wheel back to Erdini dejectedly and said, "Master, I can't turn it." Erdini turned to the other Tibetans and said, "Who wants to try it?" The Tibetans looked at each other in dismay. 2 young people jumped out and tried it, but they also retreated with dejection. At this time, the Tibetans finally believed that the prayer wheel in Erdini's hand could only be turned by people with great merit and power. Facts spoke louder than words. At this time, the situation in front of them had no choice but to believe it. The Tibetans looked at Meduo with complicated eyes and all bowed down one after another, shouting loudly, "Banda Lamb." Seeing them talking in Tibetan, Zhou Qin couldn't help but pull at Changbajila, who was in a daze, and ask in a low voice, "Uncle Changbajila, what's going on? Why are you calling Meduo Banda Lamb?" Changbajila said with a strange expression, "Sister Han, do you know what Banda Lamb means?" Zhou Qin shook her head and said, "I don't know, that's why I'm asking you." Changbajila smiled bitterly and said, "Banda Lamb means Lakshmi Goddess." Zhou Qin was shocked and said with a stunned expression, "Do you mean Meduo is the Lakshmi Goddess?" 8. Maybe. Chapter 459. Go to Watch Network. Before Zhou Qin had met Li Yundong, her understanding of Tibetan Buddhism was limited to movies and TV programs. But after she became his disciple, she began to read a lot of classics of ancient and modern Buddhism and Taoism. In particular, Li Yundong's best kung fu was the mantra Mahamudra, so Zhou Qin had also read some materials about Tibetan Buddhism. Although she didn't know that the Tibetan word Banda Lam meant auspicious goddess, she knew that auspicious goddess was an extremely important protector of Tibetan Buddhism, also known as the goddess of merit. Zhou Qin looked at Meiduo, who was not far away, dumbfounded. She had never expected that this Tibetan girl, who had been talking to her intimately before, would turn out to be the reincarnated auspicious goddess. Zhou Qin was stunned for a while and she couldn't help but feel puzzled. She turned to Changbajila and asked, "That's not right. You Tibetans are looking for reincarnated spiritual children. Aren't you looking for newborn ones? Meiduo is already 18 years old, isn't she? She doesn't look like a reincarnated spiritual child." Changbajila smiled bitterly and said, "Only the reincarnations of other gods or living Buddhas will find newborn spiritual children, and living Buddhas can calculate where they will be reincarnated. But Banda Lam is a very special god. She has two faces and two forms. One is the quiet and beautiful Banda Lam, which symbolizes purity and kindness. The other is the ferocious Tsing Lam, which symbolizes anger and majesty. When Tsing Lam shows her true body, no matter who sees her, they will die with her. I heard that in order to find Banda Lam, a few spiritual children had accidentally glanced at Tsing Lam and died with her." Zhou Qin asked in confusion, "So?" Changbajila said, "So, finding Banda Lam is the most difficult, especially when she doesn't show her true body. No one can tell where she is. Alas, I didn't expect Meiduo to be Banda Lam." Zhou Qin saw Changbajila's worried face and kept sighing. She couldn't help asking, "Isn't it a good thing that Meiduo is the reincarnation of a god? Why are you so sad?" Changbajila glanced at Zhou Qin and sighed hesitantly. "Alas, I can't explain it to you. Let's not talk about it. You'll know later. I have to pay my respects to Banda Lam quickly. If I make her angry, it won't be good." After that, Changbajila followed his clansmen and kowtowed. He respectfully prostrated himself in the snow and bowed to Meiduo. At this time, Meiduo was completely dumbfounded. She looked at the crowd around her who were worshipping her and was speechless. After a long time she stammered, "Master Erdini, you must have made a mistake. How could I be Banda Lam? Are you joking?" Erdini put his palms together and said solemnly, "How dare I lie in front of a true god? How can such a thing be joked about? The Mani wheel you just turned is called the Great Merit Mani wheel. Even if I wanted to turn it, I would have to use all my spiritual energy to barely do it. Banda Lam, you can easily turn this Mani wheel. Doesn't this mean that you are the reincarnation of a true god?" Meiduo was stunned. She stared blankly at her hands, which were as white as jade, and then looked back at the people who were kneeling on the ground. Even Dorji Tenzin, who had been joking with her just now, was kneeling on the ground respectfully, not daring to look up at her. Meiduo bent down to pull Dorji Tenzin, but he seemed to have eyes on his head. He immediately crouched down a little more and avoided her hand. Meiduo's hand froze in midair. She turned around unwillingly to pull her clansmen and said, "Everyone get up. I'm not Banda Lam. I'm Meiduo. Don't do this." When the clansmen were pulled by Meiduo, they only waved their hands in panic and kept shaking their heads, not daring to look at Meiduo. Meiduo felt as if someone had pinched her heart. She walked over to Changbajila and said in a choked voice, "Changbajila, are you going to ignore me too?" Changbajila lay on the ground motionlessly. He sighed softly and said, "Banda Lam, what do you mean by that?" Tears trickled down Meiduo's cheeks and she said with a sad expression, "Changbajila, I'm Meiduo, not Banda Lam. Why do you believe me?" Changbajila was silent for a long time before he raised his head slightly to look at Meiduo and sighed heavily. "Meiduo, the master said that you are Banda Lam. Then you are Banda Lam. Whether I believe it or not, it doesn't matter." After that he crawled deeper into the snow. No matter how much Meiduo sobbed, he never raised his head again. For a moment, everyone on the snow-wind plateau fell into silence. There was no sound on the vast and empty plateau. Only Meiduo's cries echoed in the cold wind, making people sad and moved. Meiduo looked at Zhou Qin. At this time all the people around her were kneeling on the ground. Only this Han sister was still standing in the snow, looking at her with a complicated look in her eyes. Meiduo didn't know why, but when she saw Zhou Qin's gaze, her heart ached. She couldn't help it anymore. She threw herself into Zhou Qin's arms and burst into tears. "Han sister, I'm Meiduo, not Banda Lam." Although Zhou Qin didn't understand why Meiduo was so sad, she couldn't help but feel a little sad when she heard Meiduo's sad cry. She gently patted Meiduo's back and said softly, "I know. You are Meiduo, not Banda Lam. No matter what kind of god you are, in my eyes you are Meiduo, aren't you?" When Meiduo heard this, she cried even harder. She sobbed, and her tears fell like pearls from a broken necklace. She hugged Zhou Qin tightly and sobbed, "But they don't believe that I'm Meiduo?" Zhou Qin comforted her in a soft voice, "Meiduo, what's wrong with being the reincarnation of a god? Isn't this a good thing?" Meiduo shook her head vigorously and cried, "If I were Banda Lam, I would never be able to leave Padala Palace. I wouldn't be able to go to Tianan City, I wouldn't be able to get into my Han brother's university, and I wouldn't be able to see him again." Zhou Qin let out a cry. It was as if the softest part of her heart had been hit by Meiduo's words. "If it were me, I wouldn't be able to see Li Yundong and the person I love. What would I do then?" For a moment, the resolute and strong girl seemed to empathize with Meiduo and shed tears silently. Suddenly, as if she had been possessed, she made up her mind. Zhou Qin gently patted Meiduo on the shoulder and said softly, "Meiduo, do you want to be Banda Lam? If you don't, I'll take you away even if it costs me my life." Meiduo, who was crying, was stunned and forgot to cry. Not far away, Erdini heard Zhou Qin's words and raised his head. He glared at Zhou Qin fiercely and shouted, "How dare you say such a thing?" Erdini's shout immediately shook the mountains and his voice echoed in the sky. The power was really enough to make the mountains collapse and the wind and clouds change color. The monks and lamas crawling in the snow also jumped up one by one and looked at Zhou Qin covetously, their eyes full of murderous light. Even Meiduo's clansmen raised their heads and looked at Zhou Qin with unkind eyes. They were all eager to have a try. Chengbajila raised his head in horror and shouted at Meiduo, "Meiduo, are you crazy? Do you want to kill the little Han girl?" Only then did Meiduo tremble all over. She hugged Zhou Qin and said in a sad voice, "Sister Han, don't do anything stupid. I'm just sad in my heart and want to find someone to cry with. When I'm done crying I'll be fine." After that, Meiduo couldn't help but burst into tears again. The tears fell down her round face and fell into the snow. Zhou Qin quickly glanced at the surrounding monks and quickly fixed her eyes on Meiduo. Her expression did not change as she said lightly, "Meiduo, I just want to ask you one thing. Do you want to be Banda Lam?" Meiduo stared blankly at Zhou Qin. She stared blankly at this Han sister whom she had only met once. She stared blankly at this stranger who was willing to risk her life to protect her. Everyone held their breath and looked at Meiduo, not daring to breathe too much. They were all quietly waiting for her choice. After staring at Zhou Qin for a while, Meiduo suddenly smiled sadly and quickly wiped her tears with her hand. She forced a smile and said, "Sister Han, thank you. I won't go to Tianan City. Can you help me tell Brother Han that I can't go to his school?" At this point, Meiduo couldn't help but sob. "Sister Han, when you go back, remember to tell him that there is a girl named Meiduo in Padala Palace thinking of him. When you have time in the future you can come and see her." She was originally a poor woman who loved Li Yundong deeply but couldn't get his love. At this time she had met Meiduo, who was even more pitiful than her. Even though she was usually strong-willed and had tempered her will into steel on the way to the Zhuji phase, at this time, she couldn't help but feel that the steel she had tempered had softened, and she began to shed tears of sympathy for Meiduo, who was in the same boat as her. Seeing that Zhou Qin was also crying, Meiduo thought that she was sympathizing with her. She forced a smile and comforted Zhou Qin, saying, "Don't be sad for me. I'm fine. Meiduo is very strong. In fact, it's good to be Banda Lam. Many Tibetan girls want to be Banda Lam but they can't." At this time, seeing that Meiduo had decided to be Banda Lam, Erdini also withdrew his fierce gaze and became kind again. He lowered his eyes, gently shook the prayer wheel and recited the scriptures. The monks on the side were still surrounding Meiduo, as if they were urging her to go on her way. Meiduo glanced at them, then turned around and ran to her yak. She took out a woolen cotton-padded jacket, then ran to Zhou Qin and stuffed it into her hand. Meiduo smiled and shed tears. She said, "Sister Han, I'm leaving. You have to be careful on the way. It's very cold on the top of Kari Holy Mountain. Don't get sick from the cold." Zhou Qin pinched the soft woolen cotton-padded jacket and couldn't say no. She just sighed slightly and said, "Is there anything else you want me to tell Master Li Yundong?" Meiduo smiled and shook her head. "No, I've thought it through. If we are fated to meet again in the future, I will see him again. Let's talk about it then." Zhou Qin watched Meiduo turn around and leave in a daze. Her delicate figure looked particularly sad in the wind and snow all over the sky. After Zhou Qin watched Meiduo get on Dorji Tenzin's yak, Meiduo began to sing the song that she hadn't finished before. Sixth, it's best not to face each other so that we won't meet again. 7th, it's best not to make mistakes so that we won't be disappointed. 8th, it's best not to marry so that we won't be together. 9th, it's best not to rely on each other so that we won't be together. 10th, it's best not to meet so that we won't be together. But if we've met before, we'll know each other. Why not see each other again? It's safe to say goodbye to you so that we won't miss each other in life and death. Ziyuan and Ruan Hongling, who had witnessed all this from a distance, watched in a daze as Meiduo gradually walked away with Erdini, Dorji Tenzin, and the others. Then Chengbajila led his clansmen in the opposite direction. On the snowy plateau, Zhou Qin was the only one left standing silently in the snowfield, like an ice sculpture. For a moment, the wind and snow in the vast world swept away all the footprints on the snow, and the snow fell even heavier. Chapter 460. Go to Watch Network. Looking at Zhou Qin's departing figure, Ruan Hongling sighed softly and said, I didn't expect Zhou Qin, who is usually cold and aloof, to have such a warm heart. However, she almost caused a great disaster. Go to Kanban. If Meiduo really says that she doesn't want to be Banda Lam, I'm afraid we won't be able to sit back and watch. In that case, there will be another fierce battle between the esoteric sect and the Taoists. Ziyuan sighed softly and said, although Meiduo doesn't know about the cultivation world, she knows that if she doesn't agree, I'm afraid Zhou Qin will die here. So she agreed. However, what impressed me was that Zhou Qin was still able to remain calm and composed in the face of several mountain-guarding divine monks. Not to mention anything else, just her ability to maintain her qi and her bearing have already surpassed many cultivators who have been cultivating for a long time. No matter what realm Li Yundong's cultivation will reach in the future, he can rest assured that his cultivation and kung fu will definitely be inherited by Zhou Qin in the future. In the future, she will definitely be an earth-shattering female cultivator. A sect has produced two unprecedented geniuses like Li Yundong and Zhou Qin at the same time. It's impossible for this sect not to be glorious. For some reason, Ruan Hongling suddenly thought of her Linggong sect. She felt the decline of Linggong's sect at this time and couldn't help feeling sour in her heart. What's the use of just having a powerful disciple? If all the disciples he takes in the future are powerful, then that's true ability. Ziyuan smiled slightly and said, I don't know where Li Yundong's next disciple will be. While Zhou Qin was in the Zhuji phase of Carry Holy Mountain, in the distant State University of Pennsylvania, Chris, who had been to Tianan City as an exchange student before she died, was wandering in the warm sunshine of the campus, preparing her graduation thesis. In December, Pennsylvania was suffering from a cold snap. The students in the university usually wore thick clothes and wrapped their faces tightly with scarves to prevent the cold wind from getting into their clothes. But today was a rare sunny day. The sun shone warmly on the evergreen lawn of the campus. Many beautiful female students took off their thick down jackets and revealed their beautiful and graceful figures to their heart's content. Chris was wearing a yellow hand-knitted round-neck sweater and a plaid woolen dress. She was wearing a pair of warm, flesh-colored pants. She looked exquisite, tall, and sexy. Her golden hair cascaded over her shoulders like waves, and her delicate, doll-like face attracted admiring gazes from the opposite sex wherever she went. Chris carried a few books and found a rather clean patch of grass. She then enjoyed the warm winter sun while flipping through the books in her hands. But not long after, she suddenly heard someone shouting at her from not far away, Chris, hey Chris! Chris raised her head and looked in the direction of the voice. At this time, the sun was slightly dazzling. Chris couldn't help turning her face sideways. Her golden hair fell beside her cheek, making her originally round and beautiful face even more feminine and hazy. She put a canopy in front of her forehead with her hand and narrowed her eyes slightly. She saw that it was John, whom she hadn't seen for 2 or 3 months. She immediately smiled and said, It's you, John. I haven't seen you for a long time. How have you been recently? Although John and Chris were good friends who often communicated with each other, he was still shocked by the beauty that Chris showed at this time. He slowed down his pace as if he was afraid to disturb the beauty that was like an oil painting. John couldn't help but sigh. Chris, since you came back from China, you have become more and more beautiful. Chris smiled slightly and stroked her curly hair behind her ear. Really? But I don't think there's any change. Hardadef shook his head. No, you have an additional sense of mystery and tranquil beauty about you. It's really breathtaking. Chris closed the book with a smile and said, John, did you come here specially to compliment me today? So thank you. If not, please get down to business because... Chris shook the book in her hand. I still have to prepare my graduation thesis. John took a closer look and saw that Chris was holding a Chinese book with Chinese characters written on it. He grinned and said, "Ha, I know these words." With that, John casually sat next to Chris and carefully identified a few words on the book. But after staring at it for a long time, he felt that these words were very familiar to him, but he couldn't say them out loud. He was so anxious that he scratched his ears and cheeks. Chris pursed her lips into a smile and taunted him in Chinese. "I told you that your Chinese is still far from good, but you still don't believe me." John stared at her and retorted in some awkward Chinese, "Nonsense, I'm now the student who has made the fastest progress in the Chinese class of the Confucius Institute. Even the teacher praised me for my fast progress." Chris giggled and said, "All right then, Mr. Most Improved. How come you can't even recognize such simple words?" John was so angry that he blurted out a mouthful of English and said, "Who made these words look so strange? Damn it, what the hell are these words?" Seeing that John was so anxious that the veins on his forehead were bulging, Chris couldn't help laughing. "I'm teasing you. These words are from the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor. This is an ancient seal script in Chinese. Even many Chinese may not be able to recognize it. This is my grandmother's book. When she gave it to me, I didn't even recognize these words." John breathed a sigh of relief and patted his chest in shock. "That's good. That means it's not a problem with my Chinese. Chris, you scared me just now. I thought my Chinese was still as bad as dog shit. If it's really the same as before, then my master will not want me anymore." Chris looked at John with a smile, but her beautiful eyes suddenly showed a trace of confusion. "John, do you really want to learn Kung Fu so much?" John nodded vigorously without hesitation and said, "Of course. Chris, when you first came back a few months ago, didn't you also want to learn Kung Fu from a master every day? Why are you asking such a question now?" Chris looked embarrassed. "I've thought about it, and my grandmother also supports me, but my father won't let me go. My mother also wants me to finish my studies first. I think about it myself, and I also feel that this matter is a little too illusory." John said with an exaggerated expression, "Oh my God, Chris, are you still doubting my master's ability? Have you ever seen anyone in this world who can dodge a bullet within a distance of 5 meters? Have you ever seen anyone who can jump down from the 4th floor with a person in his arms and act as if nothing happened? Have you ever seen anyone who can punch a big man like me who weighs nearly 200 pounds, 90 kilograms, into the air?" John suddenly said with a serious face, "I know that your parents want you to inherit the family business in the future, so they want to keep you by their side. However, I will definitely go to China again, and I've already applied for the visa in the past few days. The reason I came to you this time is to ask if you want to go with me." Chris lowered her head with a complicated expression. She couldn't help but recall the memories of when she had gone to Tiannan University as an exchange student. In Chris's opinion, Tiannan University was far inferior to the University of Pennsylvania in all aspects. The quality of the students and the teachers was also uneven. Even the teachers and officials of this place had left a bad impression on her. But what impressed Chris the most was the incredible Chinese boy. Every time Chris closed her eyes, she seemed to be able to see Li Yundong's supernatural performance as he dodged bullets. It was really a shocking memory that she would never forget for the rest of her life. Especially when her grandmother told her that Li Yundong might be a legendary cultivator and that he might know the art of immortality, Chris was even more tempted. She even wanted to immediately ask Li Yundong to teach her the art of immortality. But as time went by, this impulse slowly dissipated and calmed down. In the end, Chris chose to study instead of the illusory cultivation. However, just when Chris thought that she was about to forget about this matter, John appeared again. He was still worshipping that mysterious and powerful Eastern boy, and still had a heart of stone, wanting to go to the faraway East to learn from him. Chris' memory, which had already faded away, was evoked again. Her heart suddenly pounded. She lowered her head and remained silent. She just quietly stroked the exquisite cover of the book in her hand. Seeing the excitement in Chris' eyes, Hardedef said, "Chris, what are you hesitating about? Do you know how old you are? Please, you are only 20 years old. You look like an 80-year-old grandmother who is looking forward to the future. Do you know what 20 years old is? This is the age to travel around. While we are still young, we still have the courage to travel around. If you don't go out now, when will you? Are you going to regret it when you are old and can't walk anymore?" Chris' heart suddenly skipped a beat. She remembered what her grandmother, Lin Guang, had once said to her, "Chris, if you meet the real person, don't hesitate. You must find a way to worship him as your master. Otherwise, you will definitely be like me in the future, watching your youth fade away. It will be too late for regrets at this time." This sentence made the wild and adventurous spirit in Chris' blood, inherited from her sailor grandfather, burn. She slowly raised her head, and her eyes were full of sparkling light. Hardedef saw Chris' eyes and shouted in surprise, "Chris, have you decided to go to China with me?" Chris smiled and sighed. "Hardedef, you can be a politician in the future. You are very eloquent." Chris grinned. "I'm not Arnold Schwarzenegger." Chris pursed her lips and smiled. "That's right. Arnold isn't as good at fighting as you." Hardedef cooperated and made a bodybuilder's move, then made a few fighting moves. He was so excited that his eyebrows almost flew up. "Chris, when are we leaving? I can't wait to fly to China and start a new life." Chris shook her head and said with a smile, "You are really optimistic. You have to learn Chinese better. You know, that bastard doesn't seem to be very willing to accept us as disciples." Hardedef waved his hand carelessly. He said word by word in Chinese, "Chris, as the saying goes, sincerity can move metal and stone. I don't believe that my sincerity can't move master. I will definitely make him accept me as a disciple." Chris smiled and said in Chinese, "Thank God, these few sentences are quite standard. It seems that you have practiced for a long time." Hardedef laughed and switched back to English. "I practice dozens of times a day. Damn it, Chinese is too difficult to learn. But I'm going to China soon to continue learning, haha." As he said this, Hardedef happily somersaulted on the spot. He was as excited as a child and shouted with joy, "Haha, we are going to China. Chris, let's go to the east together." Chris smiled and was about to speak when she suddenly heard a voice next to her. "Go to the east? What east? Are you going to elope?" "Haha, if you are going to elope, take me with you." Chapter 461. Go to WatchNet. When Chris and John heard this, they turned their heads at the same time. They saw a tall, voluptuous girl with brown hair and blue eyes standing in front of them, smiling at them. WatchNet. 7 km. This woman was about 1.75 meters tall. Her two long legs were amazingly proportioned. She had the body of a famous model. Her waist was so slender that it seemed as if it would break with a single step. However, her chest was astonishingly magnificent. A deep ravine could be seen in the middle of her snow-white breasts. It was a dazzling sight. John recognized her at a glance. Wasn't this Alba, the school's cheerleader? Wasn't she the one who hated Chris the most? Why did he come here to join in the fun? Chris was the president of the student council and a famous campus belle. She came from a good family and had a good personality. Almost all the boys acknowledged that Chris was the best of the best. Any man who married her would be blessed by the heavens. They would be able to fight for at least 30 years less. Because of this, Chris was extremely popular in the university and was called the Goddess of Pennsylvania by the boys. She had been Miss Pennsylvania of the Year for 3 years in a row. However, the more outstanding a girl was, the more she could attract the attention of the opposite sex and the hostility of the same sex. Alba, the cheerleader in front of her, was Chris' famous nemesis at the University of Pennsylvania. For the past 3 years in a row, Chris had won the Miss Penn Award over Alba by a narrow margin. In private, Alba gnashed her teeth in hatred. More than once, she had privately cursed Chris for being a dignified and beautiful B****. From her point of view, Chris already had everything, but she just had to fight with her for the title of Miss Best of the Year, which was the icing on the cake for Chris but a timely help to her. To be able to obtain this kind of title in a well-known university many times, for a girl from an ordinary family with no power, no background, it was a kind of rich capital. But this kind of capital that should have fallen on her had been endlessly deprived by crazy. How could Alba not gnash her teeth in hatred? At this time, Alba was looking at Chris with a very jealous gaze. She said in a very sarcastic tone, "Chris, I didn't know that you were so wild. You actually want to elope?" Although John was a little unhappy, he still raised his hands and said, "Hey Alba, can you not involve me in the battle between you two?" Alba glanced at John and suddenly smiled at him. I know you. You're John from the combat club. Your performance at the gala was pretty good." Although John was big, he was not stupid. He knew that Alba mistakenly thought that he was Chris's boyfriend and wanted to dig up his past to humiliate Chris. Then she would dump him later. John quickly took a step back and said, "Alba, Chris and I have some private things to talk about. Can you do me a favor?" Alba was quite beautiful and had a very South American appearance. She giggled and said, "How can there be so many private things? Why are you two so unnatural when I come here? What are you talking about?" As she spoke, Alba glanced around and saw the inner cannon of the Yellow Emperor in Chris's hands. She smiled and said, "What book is this? Is it a book of witchcraft and magic?" Chris knew that Alba had always hated her and would make things difficult for her every time they met. She knew that once she made things difficult for Alba, everyone would immediately say that she was bullying others. Therefore she had been enduring and giving in. No matter what Alba said, she would remain silent. When Alba saw that Chris was ignoring her, she felt a little bored, but she was unwilling to leave. She quickly snatched the inner cannon of the Yellow Emperor from Chris's hands when Chris was not paying attention. Then she turned around and flipped through it. As soon as she opened it, she was dazzled by the dense square characters inside. Alba curled her lips, threw the book on the ground disdainfully and said, "What rubbish is this? Chris, are you wasting your life by looking at these things every day?" Chris frowned slightly. She bent down, picked up the book on the ground and carefully and seriously patted the dust off it. She said seriously, "Alba, you can disrespect me but you can't disrespect this book." Alba sneered and said, "What kind of witchcraft book is it that you value so much?" John couldn't help but say angrily, "Alba, this is a book that Grandma Chris gave her." Chris shook her head at John, motioning for him not to speak. Then she said seriously to Alba, "Alba, this book is called The Inner Canon of the Yellow Emperor. It comes from China. It is the earliest medical book recorded in the history of human beings on this planet. You can disrespect people but please respect history and science." Alba curled her lips and said, "Diske, what do you mean by the earliest medical book? From China? And science? In my opinion, it's just a black book full of witchcraft and superstition that records the backwardness and ignorance." Ever since John had seen Li Jiandong's magic, he had been full of yearning and longing for the mysterious country of China. He couldn't bear to hear someone slander this country, so he couldn't help but say angrily, "Alba, is your period coming or has your boyfriend dumped you? What are you doing here? We're having a good conversation. What does it have to do with you?" Alba's face changed drastically and she screamed, "This is the capital of a free country. It's none of your business where I want to go. Don't you want to go to that damn feudal country? Go, don't stay in this land of freedom." John was furious. "It's none of your business where I go." A look of displeasure flashed across Chris's face. She said in a low voice, "Alba, we don't welcome you. Please leave." Alba gritted her teeth and said, "I'm relying on you." "What are you going to do?" Chris had never seen such a scoundrel before. She shook her head with a wry smile and said to John, "Forget it, let's go." John was so angry that he laughed. "Alba, we're going to China. If you have the guts, come with us." A strange look appeared on Alba's face. She looked at the backs of Chris and John as they turned to leave. She gritted her teeth and said loudly, "If you have the guts, tell me when to go." John laughed without turning his head. "Tomorrow." Chris was shocked and quickly tugged at John's sleeve. "Hey, are you crazy? Are you leaving tomorrow?" John said curiously, "Don't you have a passport and can go abroad at any time?" "I've already got mine. If you want to go, go as soon as possible. Of course, this kind of thing should be done as soon as possible. Otherwise, if you delay for a few more days, you won't want to go, right?" Although Chris felt that it was a little hasty, she felt that what John said was reasonable. In addition, the wild spirit of adventure flowing in her blood made her a little excited. Chris nodded slightly. "Well, I'll go back and pack my luggage. Then I'll book a plane ticket tonight." John laughed heartily. "Then it's a deal." After that, he turned to Alba and laughed loudly. "Alba, we're going to China tomorrow. If you have the guts, come with us." Alba watched as John laughed arrogantly and left. She stamped her feet, cursed him, and then left angrily. The next day, John and Chris made an appointment to meet at the airport. They were about to board the plane when they suddenly saw a familiar figure dragging a suitcase and walking up to them, looking at them proudly. It was Alba. Chris and John were both stunned. Chris stared at Alba with her eyes wide open and stammered, "Alba, what are you doing?" Alba flipped her long brown hair and said proudly, "Didn't you say that I would come with you if I had the guts?" "Ha, I'm coming with you." John's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. He stammered, "Alba, are you crazy? Do you know how far China is? Aren't you afraid that your family will worry about you?" Alba rolled her eyes at John. "It's none of your business. Anyway, I'm here now. What are you going to do?" Chris was stunned and said, "But you, how did you know which flight we took?" As soon as she finished speaking, she came to her senses and turned to glare at John. "John, did you tell her?" John shrugged, spread his hands and said with a wry smile, "I didn't think she would come with us. Even if she wanted to, she wouldn't have a passport. But I didn't expect. Damn it, is this woman crazy? What is she doing here? Just because she's angry with us? Alba ignored the two of them and dragged her small suitcase to the gate. Guys, it's time to board the plane, she said. Now we're going through thick and thin together. As she spoke, she walked forward as if she were the leader of the team. Chris couldn't help but press her forehead with her hand and groan. Oh my God, what the hell is going on? John whispered with a wry smile. Why don't we get rid of her again and secretly change to another flight? As soon as he finished speaking, Alba turned her head and shouted angrily, Don't even think about getting rid of me. Chris and John looked at each other and shook their heads with wry smiles at the same time. Then they dragged their luggage to the gate. Chris couldn't help sighing. John, I have a bad feeling that our trip to China is going to be very, very bad. John also turned his head and said with a bitter smile, I agree. I can't imagine what Master will do if he sees the three of us. Oh my God, he will definitely kick me out of the door. Chris rolled her eyes at him. Has he ever accepted you as an apprentice? Vote recommendation previous page, return to table of contents, next page error report. If you like it, please click here to add Keeping a Fox at Home to your bookshelf so that you can read the latest chapters and updates of Keeping a Fox at Home in the future. If you have any suggestions or comments on Keeping a Fox at Home, please click here to express your views. Chapter 462. Go to CNET. It was supposed to be a wonderful and exciting trip, but now there was a third party. Both Chris and John felt very uncomfortable, as if they had swallowed a fly. However, Alba was sitting right between them, which made the atmosphere very awkward for a while. Go to CNET. Chris and John sighed inwardly and closed their eyes. They didn't want to talk to Alba. They were going to pretend to be dead all the way to China. But after the plane took off, Chris, who was resting with her eyes closed, suddenly heard Alba crying in a low voice next to her. Puzzled and curious, she opened her eyes and took a look, only to see Alba lying on the seat of the plane, sobbing and wiping away her tears. Although Chris didn't know what had happened, she still kindly handed over a tissue. When Alba saw the tissue, she took it without raising her head and held it tightly in her hand. However, she didn't wipe away her tears and just kept crying. Chris couldn't help but ask, Alba, if you miss home, you might as well book a ticket back as soon as you get off the plane. I'll pay for you. Alba raised her head. Her tears had ruined the makeup on her face. She cried, Why are you pretending to be a good person? Chris sighed helplessly. No matter what, we are all classmates. If you go to China with us, we can't just leave you behind, can we? What's wrong with you? Alba looked at Chris in a daze. Suddenly, she pouted and threw herself into Chris's arms with an aggrieved look on her face. She cried loudly, Chris Jack, that he dumped me for a whore. Chris smiled bitterly. John really hit the nail on the head? You didn't go to China with us because of this, did you? Alba burst into tears. I feel like a big joke. How could he do this to me? Chris sighed helplessly and patiently comforted her mortal enemy. It's fine. Maybe you can start a new relationship in China. John's hostility towards Alba had also dissipated a lot. He winked and said, By the way, Alba, I know a lot of handsome guys in China. Do you want me to introduce you to some of them? Chris glared at him. Shut up. Who else do you know besides your master? And I know the mayor, cried John. Chris remembered how John had greeted Mayor Luo and laughed. Yes, if you're not afraid of being arrested and thrown into prison, you can go find him. After crying for a while, Alba calmed down a lot. She wiped her tears and said to Chris, Chris, I'm sorry. I was dumped by Jack yesterday and I was in a bad mood. I just wanted to find someone to vent my anger on. I was a little rude. I apologize. Chris generously stretched out her hand to Alba. Let's not talk about the past. Let's be friends now, okay? Even if you're just a friend in China, will you still be an enemy when you come back? Alba looked at Chris's outstretched hand and suddenly laughed. She also reached out and shook hands with Chris. Well, let's make a truce for the time being. This beautiful South American woman's mood came and went quickly. She quickly sat up straight, wiped the tears off her face, opened her small bag and carefully touched up her makeup in front of the mirror. When she was done, she said to John excitedly, Hey, are you really going to China to elope? Wow, that's so romantic. When John saw Alba crying and laughing at the drop of a hat, he couldn't help but smile bitterly. Alba, don't play with me. Chris and I are just friends. We're going to China to be apprenticed to a master. Alba blinked and asked curiously, Apprenticed to what master? When it came to apprenticing, John became a little excited. He turned around and said excitedly, We're going to be apprenticed to a very, very powerful Chinese man. Alba became more and more curious. How powerful? In what way? John waved his hands and said, he can dodge bullets within 5 meters, catch people falling from the 5th floor with his bare hands, and deal with dozens of gangsters with his bare hands. Alba couldn't help laughing. John, you're talking about Superman. He's not in China, he's in Hollywood. John couldn't help but say angrily, Alba, I'm not joking with you. Alba stopped smiling and looked at John with a strange expression. I'm not joking with you. Superman is really in Hollywood. John was so angry that he shouted, what I just said is true. If you don't believe me, ask Chris. Alba saw that John's angry face didn't seem to be fake, so she turned to look at Chris and asked tentatively, is it true? Chris also nodded seriously. It's true. We saw it with our own eyes. I used to take pictures of it with my mobile phone, but unfortunately the teacher at the university where I was an exchange student confiscated my memory card, so alas, I could have won the Pulitzer Prize for journalism. Alba couldn't help shaking her head. She smiled and said, impossible, I don't believe it. How could there be such a person in this world? Chris smiled slightly. Alba, you'll know when you see him. Alba smiled and said, if there really is such a person, then I'll also be apprenticed to him. As soon as she finished speaking, John burst out laughing. That's impossible. Alba was a little unconvinced. Why not? She asked. John looked at Chris and Chris happened to look at him as well. The two of them laughed in unison. Because you can't speak Chinese. Alba stared at him with her blue eyes and said, what does speaking Chinese have to do with not being apprenticed to him? John said gloatingly, this is Master's rule. He said that if you want to learn his kung fu, you must first learn Chinese or he won't teach you. Alba frowned. Can't I even hire an interpreter? John laughed and shook his finger. No, of course not. Alba was tongue-tied. Is it too late for me to learn it now? John became more and more proud. Chinese is very difficult to learn. It's too late to learn it now. Besides, even if you learn it, Master may not accept you. Alba frowned. Why is that? John pointed at Chris. Chris's Chinese is good enough, isn't it? Why didn't Master accept her at the beginning? Because Master said that his kung fu is only passed on to men, not women. Alba was originally stubborn and extreme, and she also had some feminist ideas. When she heard this, she immediately became angry. Regardless of the fact that she was on the plane, she stood up and said angrily, what kind of man is this? What era are we in? How can there still be such rotten ideas? You want to be apprenticed to such a person? Oh my God, are you all out of your minds? She was tall, so when she stood up on the plane she really stood out. All the people on the plane looked at her in unison. The stewardess immediately walked up to her and whispered with a smile, hello madam. Please keep your voice down. Thank you. Seeing that everyone was staring at her, Alba forced a smile and sat down angrily. She still kept complaining in a low voice, what's the big deal? This is obviously sexism. She complained in a low voice for a while, then turned to look at Chris and asked in confusion, hey, you know that it's unlikely that you will be his apprentice, so why did you go to China? Chris was still focused on the inner cannon of the Yellow Emperor in her hand. With a faint expression, she said in Chinese, nothing in the world is difficult for those who set their minds to it. Alba was confused. What? John, who was standing to one side, giggled. He explained this sentence in English with a smile, and then said with a smile, there's another saying. John said in Chinese, sincerity can break open metal and stone. Alba stared at him as if she were looking at an alien and said, what? What? Say it again? John repeated the words carefully, word by word. Alba followed him like a parrot, but no matter how hard she tried, it was very difficult to pronounce. After repeating it a few times, Alba covered her face with her hands and lamented, oh my God, I feel like my tongue is tied in a bow. I'm starting to regret going to this country with you. How am I going to talk to these Chinese people who can tie bow knots with their tongues in the future? Chris held back her laughter and said lightly, when you get off the plane in Shanghai, you can take the earliest flight. I'll buy you a ticket. Alba immediately put down her hands, stared at her and said, don't even think about getting rid of me. I won't run away. No matter what, I have to see what this hateful, damned misogynist bastard looks like. I also want to scold him for his male chauvinism and his decadent and old-fashioned ideas. I want him to know that he lives in the 21st century, not in the damned ancient society. Hearing this, John turned pale with fright and quickly said, no, Master will be angry. He is very powerful. You can't make him angry. Alba glanced at John and asked, "Why are you so nervous?" Soon, Alba suddenly understood and said, "Oh, you're afraid that if I make him angry, he won't accept you as his disciple, right?" John nodded with a wry smile on his face. Alba laughed proudly and said, "Ha, from now on, I'm the leader of this small team. If any of you don't listen to me, I'll make trouble. I'll make sure you can't become my disciple." John slapped his forehead with his hand and groaned in pain. "Oh my God, why did I send you the flight details?" John turned his head to look at Chris with a pained expression, only to see that the blonde beauty was still calmly reading her book. He couldn't help but ask, "Chris, aren't you worried?" Chris sighed softly and said, "What's there to worry about?" Alba smiled triumphantly and said, "That's right. Hey John, from now on you are my subordinate. You have to listen to me, otherwise, Before she could finish her words, Chris said slowly, "I heard that a large number of people go missing in China every year. I believe one more American is no big deal." The smile on Alba's face froze and John, who was beside her, laughed wildly. After laughing for a while, he suddenly put on a serious face and said to Chris, "Chris, why don't we bury Alba behind the airport after we get off the plane?" Chris also closed her book and said seriously, "No, it's better to put her in the suitcase." John frowned and said, "Alba is too tall, and she has a big skeleton and a lot of meat. What if we can't put her in?" Chris snapped her fingers and said, "Haven't you seen Texas Chainsaw Massacre?" Alba looked at the two people beside her and couldn't help but say angrily, "You two murderers, can you not say such things in front of the people involved when you are planning to kill?" As she said this, Alba's voice suddenly rose by an octave. She pointed at John and said in a shrill voice, "John, explain to me clearly. What do you mean by my big skeleton and a lot of meat?" Chris finally couldn't hold it in any longer. She convulsed with laughter. Alba gnashed her teeth and said, "You two bastards, don't try to scare me. When I see this guy, I will definitely scold him until he's all black and blue." Chapter 463. Go to WatchNet. The three of them chatted and laughed. After a day on the plane, they finally arrived at Shanghai's Hongqiao Airport. As soon as they got off the plane, Alba, who was tired all the way, shouted to find a hotel to stay in, but Chris and John, who had just returned to China, were full of energy and excitement. WatchNet. 7 km. Hardadef denied Alba's words and said, No, it's morning now. We have to hurry to Master City as soon as possible. It's quite far from here." Chris also looked at her watch and said, "Well, now this country's high-speed rail is the fastest in the world. I believe we should be able to reach Tianan City from Shanghai by noon. We can even make it to Tianan University for lunch there." John shouted exaggeratedly, "Oh my God, the food in this school is terrible. I'll starve to death if I line up." Chris shrugged. "Then let's eat near the school," Hardadef said with a smile. "Good idea, my treat." Alba couldn't help but say angrily, "Are you too used to ignoring me? Aren't you afraid that I'll make trouble for you?" Chris and John turned their heads at the same time and looked at Alba strangely. The two of them suddenly started talking in Chinese. John said, "Chris, I think we'd better use the method in Saw." Chris shook her head. "That's too bloody." John said exaggeratedly, "Isn't the Texas Chainsaw Murderer bloody?" Chris said seriously, "I think it's better if you teach her a few curses, and then let her go to the gate of the Chinese government to greet those officials. As long as she does this, she will be sent back to her country immediately if she isn't thrown into a black prison." Hardadef chuckled mischievously. "That's a good idea, I like it." Alba saw the two of them talking furtively in Chinese and laughing sinisterly from time to time. Although she couldn't understand what they were talking about, she still felt creeped out. She raised her hands high and said in surrender, Okay, I won't make trouble. Don't murmur about plotting to kill me in Chinese." John laughed. "Alba, you're so smart." Alba was so angry that she kicked John. "You bastard, I curse you to fall off a cliff and die." John chuckled. "I don't do mountain climbing or bungee jumping." Alba rolled her eyes at him. "Of course I know. Otherwise, how would I dare to make such a curse? My curse is very effective." Chris tried to smooth things over by saying, Okay, let's go take the high-speed train. It's getting late." The three of them dragged their luggage and walked quickly towards the train station. The man was tall and the woman was beautiful. They attracted many people's attention along the way. When they arrived at Tianan City, the three of them stopped a taxi. Chris got in the car and said, "Sir, please go to Tianan University." When the taxi driver saw that such a beautiful foreign girl could speak fluent Chinese, he was shocked. He didn't dare to cheat her, so he drove the car to the school gate. At this time the school was over at noon. The three of them stood in the crowd of black heads, which was really eye-catching, attracting the attention of the surrounding teachers and students. Alba looked at the gate and the buildings of Tiannan University with a critical face and kept shaking her head. Oh my god, this school is at least 50 years behind us. Can this school produce a Superman? I don't believe it. John was very excited when he thought that he would see Li Yundong soon. It was rare that he didn't bicker with her. He just looked around as if he wanted to find Li Yundong's figure. Chris, who was standing on her tiptoes, was also looking into the distance. After looking for a while, she suddenly saw a familiar figure. She immediately waved her arms in surprise and shouted, "Feng! Feng!" She shouted a few times but the other party ignored her. Only then did she realize that she had called the wrong person, so she shouted again, "Feng Na!" Feng Na, who was talking with Ching Ching in the school and walking out of the school, heard the shout. She raised her head and curiously looked in the direction of the voice. When she saw who it was, she was suddenly stunned. "Chris? Why is she here? Is the school having an exchange activity again?" Ching Ching, who was standing to the side, rolled her eyes. She snorted and said with a very ambiguous smile, "The foreign horse is here to steal your lover." Feng Na glared at her. "My man? I don't have a lover." Ching Ching said with a smirk, "Don't pretend. She's your dream lover, you know." The smile on Feng Na's face suddenly faded. She sighed softly and said, "It's not my turn. Don't make such a joke. I don't even dare to dream about such a thing. Come on, let's go see Chris. I don't know why they're here." Feng Na and Ching Ching had attended Zhou Qin's birthday party with Chris and the others, so they had a good relationship in private. When they parted ways, they had exchanged gifts with each other. Feng Na greeted her with a smile and said in English, "Chris, why are you here?" However, Chris replied in Chinese with a smile on her face, "I'm here for Li Yundong." After she finished speaking, Ching Ching, who was beside her, quietly pinched Feng Na's arm. Feng Na glanced at Ching Ching and sighed in her heart. She still replied politely in English, "Chris, did you come all the way here just to see Li Yundong?" Chris didn't know that the girl in front of her was already a little jealous. She blinked and said, "Yes, I came to find him." John also came over and said, "I also came to find him." Alba didn't want to be left out. She leaned over and said seriously, "I came to scold him." Feng Na looked at Alba with a strange expression and thought to herself, "Who is this woman? Is she crazy?" Although Feng Na felt strange, she still smiled politely at Alba and then said to Chris, "Li Yundong hasn't been to school for a long time." Chris and John were shocked at the same time. "What? He dropped out of school?" Feng Na shook her head. "No, he just went through the formalities of suspension." John smiled bitterly. "Damn it, what should we do? Where did he go?" Chris quickly asked, "What is he doing now?" Feng Na's eyes showed strong admiration and she said proudly, "He has opened a tea house of his own. I went there last time it opened." Ching Ching also showed off excitedly, although she had used this matter more than once. "Do you know who went to the opening ceremony?" "The secretary of the provincial party committee, the top leader." "Ah, it's equivalent to your governor." "Governor?" Chris, Alba, and John exclaimed in surprise at the same time and looked at each other. In the United States, politicians like governors often made some show of being close to the people, and it was not uncommon for them to see or even talk to the governor. However, it was not a small matter for any enterprise to invite a governor for the opening. This was a manifestation of resources and connections. Chris knew that Li Yundong was extraordinary and had superhuman strength, but she didn't know that he had such a political background. She was stunned for a moment and asked, "Where is this tea house? Can you take us there?" Feng Na and Ching Ching looked at each other, then Feng Na smiled and said, "Okay, I'll call him and see if he's there." She took out her cell phone and made a call, but no one answered. Feng Na couldn't help but say angrily, "That be asterisk starred. I told him last time not to use his cell phone as a landline, but he didn't listen." She said helplessly to Chris, "Forget it, let's go straight to him. His tea house has only been open for less than a month. I believe that he should be taking care of the business in the tea house every day. If we go there and take advantage of him, it can be considered as robbing the rich to help the poor." Chris smiled slightly. "Eh." John also shouted excitedly, "Master has opened a tea house. That's amazing. I want to go and have tea too." Only Alba, who was dragging her luggage, shouted, Hey, are you going to run around with your luggage?" However, after complaining for a while, she saw that Chris and John were talking and laughing with Feng Na and Ching Ching, ignoring her at all. She immediately stomped her feet resentfully and chased after them angrily. When the group arrived at the Desangxian tea house on the pedestrian street of Tianan City, Feng Na was surprised to find that the door of the Desangxian tea house was closed. She was shocked and quickly found the receptionist of Zhao's tea house across the street. "Hello, may I ask why the tea house across the street isn't open?" The receptionist said gloatingly, "It's been closed for 16 days. Feng Na turned pale with fright. "What happened?" The receptionist shook her head slightly. "I don't know." Feng Na was stunned. It took her a while to react. She forced a smile at the receptionist and said, "Thank you, sorry to disturb you." When she turned around and walked back, she heard the receptionist at the door whisper, "According to them, it would be strange if they didn't close the door." "That's right. How can they solicit customers like that?" Hearing this, Feng Na felt strange. She turned her head to look at them, only to see that the receptionists were looking straight ahead, as if they hadn't said anything at all. Feng Na was suspicious, and Chris, who was next to her, also asked in surprise, "Feng Na, what happened?" Feng Na shook her head with a worried expression. "I don't know, but something must have happened. Damn it, I don't know where Li Yundong lives and he doesn't answer my phone. What should I do? What should I do?" Alba saw that the two of them were speaking Chinese, so she pulled hard enough to translate. After listening, she sneered and said, "This guy named Li Yundong must be afraid that I'll scold him, so he's hiding like a coward." When Feng Na and Cheng Cheng heard this, they immediately became furious and glared at Alba. Just as Feng Na was about to retort, she suddenly heard two people coming over and whispering to each other, "This Jinren Li is really cautious. For the Taoist assembly, he actually handed over the shop to those coquettish foxes early. Now he's even closed the shop. Hey, do you think he's preparing some powerful magic treasure?" "It's possible, but no matter how much he prepares, it's useless. Hey, Shixiang is really worrying for nothing. Once his powerful magical weapon is refined, no matter how capable Li Yundong is, he will have to admit defeat." "That's not necessarily true. Jinren Li's ability is not just for show. He has to fight." What do you mean by fighting? There are so many coquettish foxes around this guy. Even if he can fight, the iron pestle will be ground into embroidery needles. When the Taoist assembly comes, his legs will be weak. How can he fight?" Speaking of this, the two of them giggled in a low voice. When Feng Na heard them mention Jinren Li, her heart suddenly skipped a beat. She remembered that at the opening ceremony, hadn't someone also called Li Yundong Jinren Li? She thought to herself, could the Jinren Li these two guys are talking about be Li Yundong? Thinking of this, Feng Na couldn't help stepping forward and asking, "Hello, is the Jinren Li you're talking about Li Yundong?" The two of them hadn't expected that their casual conversation would be overheard by Feng Na. They were slightly shocked, looked Feng Na up and down, and asked warily, "Who are you?" "You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."